What if the quietest voice held the greatest truth? In a world filled with noise, stress, and rushing thoughts, Zen wisdom offers a pausier, breather return to what matters. These stories don't shout, they whisper. Through gentle reflection and timeless Buddhist teachings, they open a door to stillness. In just a few minutes, each story can soften the mind, settle the heart, and guide us gently toward inner harmony, the kind that doesn't depend on the world around us, but the world within. Let's get started. The monk who folded the wind. In the high mountains where the clouds move like slow dreams, there lived a quiet monk who was known for doing something strange. He folded the wind. Many doubted the story, thinking it was just a poetic way of saying he was peaceful. But those who visited the remote monastery swore that when they sat with him, the air itself stilled, and the wind softened as if it, too, was listening. The story begins on a stormy evening when a young traveler arrived at the mountain temple, drenched and breathless. The wind was howling, pushing at trees, making the bells on the eaves cry out like frightened children. The traveler, bitter from his long and difficult climb, asked the monk, "How do you stay calm when everything around you is wild and loud? This windit never stops screaming." The monk smiled gently and motioned for the traveler to sit beside him. He said nothing for a while, only watching the clouds swirl below them. Then he slowly reached out and cupped his hands in the air, as if catching something invisible. The traveler watched, confused. The monk whispered, "The wind is loud only if you chase it. Fold it into your breath, let it pass through your ribs like a song." He then told a story not of gods or kings, but of a boy who had once lived in the valley. That boy hated the wind. He yelled at it, fought it, covered his ears, but the more he resisted, the louder it became. One day, the boy climbed the mountain to escape it, only to find the wind even stronger there. Exhausted, he collapsed beside an old monk who said nothing but offered him tea. They sat quietly, and for the first time the boy noticed the wind not as an enemy but as something ancient and wild and free. It hadn't changed. He had. The traveler sat frozen, his anger and weariness beginning to melt into something else understanding. In that moment, the wind didn't stop, but it moved around them like a friend passing through. The monk had not stopped the wind, he had stopped the resistance. Moral of the story: peace does not come from controlling the world, but from releasing the need to control. Like folding the wind into stillness, true calm comes when we stop pushing and start accepting. What disturbs us outside only has power if we allow it inside. The next story is called Autumn's Whisper on the Bamboo Path. As the seasons shifted and golden leaves began to drift through the air like forgotten memories, a gentle hush settled over a small Zen temple hidden deep within a forest of tall bamboo. This place was sacred, not because of grand statues or chants, but because of the silence that lived therein, silence that spoke louder than words ever could. One morning, as autumn deepened, an elderly monk walked the bamboo path, his robes brushing against the cool earth, his hands folded calmly in front of him. Following behind him was a young novice, struggling to keep his thoughts quiet. The boy's mind was noisy with doubts about his worth, his path, and his future. He had come to the temple seeking peace, but all he found within himself was restlessness. As they walked, the wind stirred, and leaves began to fall gently, swirling and gliding across the path. The bamboo swayed with a soft rhythm, as though the forest itself were breathing. The young monk sighed and asked, "Why is it that I still feel lost? I came here to find stillness, but my mind is louder than ever." The elder stopped walking and simply pointed to a single leaf as it drifted from the canopy above. "Watch," he said softly. The leaf floated with grace, spinning, dipping, rising slightly before falling again, until it landed silently on the path. "Did you see it fight the wind?" the monk asked. "Did it question where it was going?" The boy said nothing. The monk continued, "That leaf knows it will fall. The wind carries it where it must go, but it doesn't resist. In letting go, it dances. It becomes part of the wind, part of the season. Your mind is like the wind, and your thoughts are like the leaf. Let them move, let them fall. There is peace in surrender." The young novice felt something shift subtle, like a breeze that passes behind your neck. His chest softened, his breath deepened, and for the first time he heard the quiet whisper of autumn all around him. It wasn't just the season changing, it was him. Moral of the story: inner harmony is found not by silencing all thought, but by letting thoughts move through us like leaves on the wind. When we stop grasping and start listening, even the falling leaves can become a path to peace. The next story is called The Pebble That Remembered. Near a quiet river that wound through the base of an old monastery, there lay countless smooth pebbles shaped by time and water. Monks often walked barefoot along its banks during meditation, feeling the cool stones beneath their feet, silent teachers of patience, impermanence, and quiet resilience. Among these was one small grey pebble that looked no different from the rest, yet the elder monks called it the pebble that remembered. One day, a young monk named Sato, burdened by grief over the recent death of his mother, wandered to the river seeking relief. His thoughts were heavy, his eyes full of tears, and no amount of chanting brought him peace. He sat near the edge, clutching a small stone he picked at random. He whispered to it, "Why do the teachings tell me to let go when my heart refuses? How can I move on?" The abbot, who had quietly followed, sat beside him and gently touched the stone in Sato's hand. "That pebble has been here for 1,000 storms," he said. "It remembers every flood, every drought, every step pressed into it by the foot of a passing monk. It did not fight the river, it did not curse the rain, it simply stayed, and it changed." The young monk looked down at the stone, now resting still and cool in his palm. It bore the soft curves of endless surrender. The abbot continued, "Your sorrow is not something to cast away. Let it pass through you, again and again, like the water that smoothed this pebble. With time, your grief will not disappear, but it will reshape you. And like this stone, you will remember not with pain, but with presence." Sato held the stone tighter, tears still falling but softer now, no longer a storm, but a quiet stream. The wind stirred the grass, and the river whispered against the bank. In that moment, he did not need to understand everything. He only needed to feel it and let it be. Moral of the story: healing does not come from forgetting, but from remembering gently. Like the river smooths the stone, time and stillness soften pain. When we stop resisting our sorrow and sit with it in compassion, we are slowly transformed, not broken, but shaped. The next story is called Silence Between Two Bowls. In a secluded temple high in the misty hills of Kyoto, two monks and a young, one old shared a daily ritual. Each morning before sunrise, they would sit across from each other and eat from two simple wooden bowls carved by hand generations ago. The bowls were nearly identical, plain, round, and worn with age, but between them sat something even more meaningful than the food they held: silence. The young monk, Jun, was new to the temple. He struggled with the silence. Each morning, while eating, his thoughts raced. What is my purpose? Am I enough? Why does the master never speak while we eat? The quiet felt heavy, like an unanswered question that grew louder with every bite. One cold morning, after weeks of this quiet routine, Jun finally asked, "Master, why do we eat together in silence? Why not speak, even a little?" The elder monk looked up slowly, his gaze calm, and said, "Look at your bowl." Jun glanced down at his half-eaten rice and miso. "I see it," he replied. "No," the elder said softly. "You see food, but your bowl holds more than rice. It holds your habits, your hurry, your hunger to be filled by something other than this moment. Our silence is not empty. It's the space where awareness begins." The wind rustled the temple walls as if to echo his words. The elder continued, "Between your bowl and mine is not just a table. There is life unfolding, steam rising, heartbeat slowing, breath softening. When we speak, we fill the air with sound. But when we are silent, we make room for truth to appear. To eat in silence is to taste more than food. It is to taste time, presence, and grace." Jun sat back, eyes wide, suddenly aware of the warmth of the bowl in his hands, the scent of the rice, the sound of his own breath. It was all there waiting to be seen, heard, and honored. The silence was not a barrier. It was a bridge. Moral of the story: silence is not emptiness, it is a sacred space where awareness grows. In the quiet between two bowls, we learn to notice life as it truly is. When we stop filling every moment with noise, we begin to taste the richness of now. The next story is called Tea Steam and the Forgotten Bell. In a small village temple, nestled between forest and field, there lived a monk known for brewing the most delicate tea. Villagers would walk for hours just to taste it, not because of the tea leaves themselves, but because of the way the monk prepared it, with stillness, with breath, and with full presence. The tea wasn't made. It was offered. Every afternoon at the same time, the monk would ring a small bronze bell, its chime floating over the hills like a soft call to pause. People would come quietly, sit and sip. They said the tea made their hearts slower, their thoughts quieter. No one ever spoke during tea. Words were left at the door like muddy sandals. But one autumn day, as a cold wind swept down from the mountains, the monk forgot to ring the bell. He had spent the morning in silent prayer, and by the time the tea was ready, the sun had already begun to dip. The cups were poured, the steam rose, but no one came. He waited in silence, a cup in front of him, the other untouched. The steam curled upward in thin silver ribbons, dancing in the golden light. No voices, no footsteps. Only the sound of boiling water settling into stillness. The forgotten bell hung silently beside him, and for the first time the monk drank the tea alone. As he sipped, he felt something shift, not in the tea, but within. The taste was the same, but the experience was different. There was no performance, no offering, no audience. There was only the steam, the warmth in his hands, the quiet in his chest. He noticed the small things, the way the steam wove through the air like incense, how it disappeared just as it became beautiful. He closed his eyes and smiled. The bell had not been forgotten, it had simply been silent, like a breath between thoughts. That silence was the invitation. The next day, when the villagers returned, they asked, "Why didn't you ring the bell?" The monk replied, "I did, but not with sound." Moral of the story: not all calls are loud. Some come in silence, in steam, in the quiet unfolding of a moment. Presence doesn't always need to be announced. When we are truly still, we begin to hear the invitations the world offers without words, without noise, only awareness. The next story is called The Empty Brush of the Calligrapher. Long ago, in a quiet Zen temple nestled near the sea, there lived a renowned calligrapher named Ryu. His work was admired across the land, elegant strokes that seemed to breathe, characters that held stillness and motion at once. Many believed his talent was a gift from the heavens. Yet Ryu often said nothing, only bowing politely when praised. One morning, a young monk named Haru came to Ryu with a simple request: "Please teach me how to write like you." Ryu nodded and led him to a room where light fell softly across the tatami floor. He handed Haru a brush, thick with history and worn at the tip. In front of them sat an empty scroll. Ryu dipped his own brush into the ink, then paused. He hovered over the paper for a long time, but never moved. After some minutes, he placed the brush down and said, "The lesson is finished." Confused and disappointed, Haru asked, "But you didn't write anything?" Ryu smiled. "But I did. In the space between impulse and action, I offered the truest character." Still puzzled, Haru asked, "How can a brush that never touched the paper be a lesson?" Ryu turned to him gently. "Calligraphy is not about writing beautifully, it is about writing truthfully. Most people write to impress, to prove, to be seen. But Zen calligraphy begins with emptiness, with watching the breath, feeling the silence, and waiting until the stroke comes on its own. Today, the stroke never came, so I waited. That, too, is calligraphy." Haru felt something shift inside. All his life, he had tried to force beauty to chase perfection. But now he saw, the most powerful stroke is the one that rises from stillness, not struggle. In the days that followed, Haru practiced not to write, but to wait. And in his waiting, the brush finally moved not with effort, but with grace. Moral of the story: true expression is born from stillness, not from striving. Like an empty brush held with intention, our deepest truths appear when we stop forcing and start listening. In the pause before the action, we often find the purest form of wisdom. The next story is called "Where the Owl Sleeps with No Moon." In a forest so deep that even the stars seemed to hesitate above its canopy, there was a place where no path led and no map could guide. Here, among twisted roots and thick mist, was an ancient tree hollow and vast where an owl slept, though no one had ever seen it. The monks of a distant temple spoke of this owl not as a creature, but as a symbol, a guardian of unseen truths, said to sleep only on nights when no moon lit the sky. A young monk named Cain had long struggled with fear of failure, fear of being alone, fear of what could not be seen or named. Every night, as others rested peacefully, Cain lay awake, haunted by thoughts that moved like shadows. He often prayed for clarity, for signs, for some light to show him the way through his restless mind. One night, the moon vanished behind thick clouds. The forest turned black and breathless. The elders whispered, "Tonight, the owl sleeps." Cain asked what it meant, and an old nun replied gently, "It means there is a wisdom that only reveals itself in darkness. To fear the dark is to fear your own depth." With that, Cain left the temple gates and walked alone into the forest. Each step forward felt like walking through his own uncertainty. The trees closed in. There was no path, no stars, no direction, only the sound of his heartbeat and the crunch of twigs beneath his feet. Eventually, Cain stopped beneath a towering tree. He could not see the owl, but he felt Itzelent, watching, still. He sat down, legs crossed, heart open. He waited, breathing in the thick, dark air. There was no light, but there was presence. No answers, but no panic. In the silence, he finally met the part of himself he had always tried to avoid. There was no revelation, no voice from above, only a strange peace rising from within. Like the owl, wisdom had been sleeping there all along, waiting for him to sit quietly, without trying to chase it. Moral of the story: some truths do not arrive in the light. When we stop fleeing our darkness, we discover that it holds its own kind of guidance. Stillness in the unseen is not emptiness, it is depth. And within that depth, quiet wisdom waits patiently, like the owl who sleeps where no moon dares to shine. The next story is called Cloud's Lesson to the Mountaintop. High above the valleys, where the air is thin and words are few, stood an ancient mountaintop cloaked in silence and snow. The monks of the nearby temple often spoke of it as a sacred place so high that even the wind bowed in reverence. Yet, for all its height, the mountain had never moved, never changed, and never questioned its place. But the sky around it did. One day, a single white cloud drifted toward the summit, gentle and slow. The mountain, proud and still, greeted it with cold silence. The cloud, light and warm, floated above and whispered, "You are strong, old one, but do you know what it is to change?" The mountain rumbled softly, "I am rooted in truth. I do not move. I do not change. That is my strength." The cloud circled playfully, "And yet you wear snow in winter and flowers in spring. The wind carves lines into your face. You rise, yes, but you also crumble." The mountain was quiet for a long time. The cloud continued, "I am not weak because I move. I am not lost because I change. I carry rain to the thirsty, shade to the weary, and vanish when the sky is done with me. I do not stay, but I serve." From far below, a young monk sat watching this dance in the sky, unaware of the silent conversation. He had climbed the long path seeking answers, believing that by reaching the top he would find enlightenment. But as he sat beneath the shifting sky, he saw the mountain did not speak, and the cloud did not stay. Yet something sacred passed between them, movement meeting stillness, form meeting formlessness. The monk bowed deeply, not to the mountain and not to the cloud, but to the space between them. Moral of the story: wisdom is not only in standing firm like a mountain, but in flowing like a cloud. True harmony lies in knowing when to hold and when to let go. Change is not the opposite of strength, it is strength in motion. When we embrace both stillness and surrender, we learn to serve life just as it is. The next story is called The Gate That Opens Inward. At the edge of a quiet monastery, far beyond the rice fields and morning bells, stood a simple wooden gate. It was not grand or carved with symbols, but every monk knew its lesson well. Unlike all the other gates in the temple, this one opened only inward, not by design, but by intention. A young seeker named Riku arrived one summer afternoon, carrying a heavy pack and a heavier heart. He had traveled far, searching for peace in every corner of the world: temples, mountains, masters, and scriptures. But nothing had stayed with him. His longing always returned like an echo. When he reached the monastery, he paused before the wooden gate and pushed. It didn't move. He stepped back, tried again. Still, the gate held firm. Frustrated and sweating, he knocked loudly, certain someone would come. No one did. As evening fell, his frustration turned to sorrow. He sat down beside the gate, exhausted. An old monk soon appeared from within. Riku stood quickly and asked, "Why is the gate locked? I've come all this way, searching. Won't you let me in?" The monk smiled and gently pointed to the gate's edge. "Push inward," he said. Confused but willing, Riku tried again, this time pulling toward himself. The gate opened easily, quietly. No lock, no trick, just direction. They sat together inside the temple as night settled in. The monk poured tea and spoke softly. So many arrive at this gate trying to force their way in. They believe peace lies beyond, in something outside themselves. But the gate is not a barrier, it's a mirror. Riku stared at his cup, trembling slightly in his hands. The monk continued, "The gate opens only inward because true peace does not come from searching outward. It begins when we turn toward our own heart. You carried everything with you all along. What felt locked was only waiting for you to look within." Riku did not reply, but tears fell silently into his tea. He had reached the end of his journey, not by going farther, but by finally stopping, facing not the world, but himself. Moral of the story: the path to peace is not found by chasing more, it begins the moment we turn inward. Like a gate that opens only toward the self, True understanding requires no force, only the courage to look gently within. What we seek is not out there, it has always been quietly waiting inside. The next story is called The Spider and the Falling Star. In the dark silence before dawn, deep in the forest near a forgotten shrine, a spider spun its delicate web between two branches. Each thread glistened with dew, so fine and perfect it seemed like starlight frozen in air. The spider worked in stillness, with no thought of praise or beauty-only presence. Not far away, an old monk sat beneath a tree, wrapped in his robe, watching the skies slowly shift from black to soft blue. His eyes were tired but open. He had prayed all night for a sign that his life's path still mattered, that his efforts to help others had not vanished like smoke. He felt empty, worn, almost invisible in the great turning of the world. Just then, across the early morning sky, a falling star streaked downward, cutting the heavens in silence. The monk gasped softly. It was so brief, brilliant, yet gone before it could be named. He stood and whispered, "Such beauty, and it disappears without anyone even seeing it. What is the point of such a light?" He walked slowly through the forest, thoughts heavy, until he came upon the spider's web catching the faint glow of dawn. The strands shimmered, glowing gold and silver, each thread holding a perfect drop of water. The monk knelt to look closer and noticed something astonishing. Caught in one delicate strand was a single ember of lighter glowing speck. It was the last trace of the falling star. The spider moved toward it, not with fear or urgency, but with calm. It paused, as if acknowledging the light, then continued weaving, folding the ember gently into its design. The web glowed softly in the dim morning light, now holding a star within it. The monk bowed his head, overcome with stillness. The star had not vanished. It had simply landed where someone could receive it. Moral of the story: not all light is meant to last, and not all beauty is seen by many. Yet even a fleeting spark can become part of something greater when met with quiet care. True meaning is not in how long we shine, but in where we land and who holds us with grace. The next story is called A Blade of Grass Recites the Sutras. In a windswept field behind an old Zen temple, there grew wild grasses tall, slender, swaying endlessly with the breath of the earth. Few noticed them. They were not as admired as the cherry trees or the lotus pond, but one monk, old and nearly blind, would sit among them each morning, still and silent, as if listening to a voice no one else could hear. A young student named Haru, full of questions and restlessness, once followed the monk into the field. He watched the elder sit quietly, his hands folded, his gaze cast downward where the sun painted soft shadows over the grass. They stayed there for a long timino, chanting, no bowing, no scrolls. Just the wind. After some time, Haru asked, "Master, what are you listening to? There are no teachings out here, no sutras to recite." The old monk smiled faintly. "You're wrong," he said. "The sutras are everywhere. You simply haven't learned how to hear them." He reached out and touched the nearest blade of grass, so gently it didn't even bend. "This one has been reciting the Dharma for longer than I've been alive," he whispered. "It bows with the wind, rises with the sun, accepts the rain without complaint. It never rushes, never boasts. It grows because it is time to grow. It rests when it must. Tell me, Haru, what deeper wisdom could any scripture hold?" Haru sat stunned. The grass swayed all around him, a quiet chorus of being. Each blade moved together but not identically. He closed his eyes and listened, not for words, but for rhythm, for stillness, for the teaching beneath sound. The wind swept across the field once more, and in that breeze, Haru felt something shift. It wasn't loud, it wasn't clear, but it was real. Something in the center of his chest softened, like a knot untying. The sutras had not been missing. He had just been too busy searching for them in ink and sound, when all along they had been speaking in silence and movement. Moral of the story: wisdom is not always found in words. When we slow down and observe the world with open hearts, even the simplest things, a blade of grass, a breeze, a moment of stillness, can become sacred teachers. The Dharma is not only spoken, it is lived. It grows all around us, waiting for us to notice. The next story is called Monk Dogen's Misplaced Slipper. In a quiet corner of a Zen monastery, long ago in Japan, lived the great teacher Dogen, known for his deep wisdom and simple living. He taught that enlightenment was not something distant, but found in ordinary moments, in walking, cleaning, even in breathing. Everything, he said, was part of the path. One cold morning, after meditation, the monks lined up quietly for chores. The temple grounds were covered in frost, and their breath curled like smoke in the air. Dogen, humble as always, walked among them, dressed no differently than the rest. But as he stepped into the main hall, he paused. He looked down and noticed that he was wearing only one slipper. A young novice, seeing this, rushed forward. "Master, your slipper. You've lost one. Let me bring another pair." Dogen smiled gently and shook his head. "No need," he replied. "Let the foot feel the cold." The novice was confused. "But why, master? Doesn't it hurt?" Dogen stepped forward slowly, his bare foot pressing into the cold stone floor. "Yes," he said softly, "it hurts, but the ground is not my enemy. The pain reminds me I am alive, that I am walking here now. Even this moment, cold and incomplete, is part of the practice." Later that day, Dogen addressed the monks. He spoke not of grand sutras or distant awakenings, but of the slipper. "Sometimes," he said, "we try to fix the moment too quickly. We rush to replace discomfort with comfort, confusion with answers, loss with new gain. But not all things must be fixed. Some must simply be felt." The room was quiet. The wind tapped gently against the paper walls. He continued, "The slipper was not lost. It was misplaced. And in that, the moment revealed itself. Life is not always even, but every uneven step still walks the path." The monks bowed, understanding blooming like warmth in winter. Moral of the story: not all discomfort must be corrected. Sometimes, in feeling life just as it is, cold, imperfect, or incomplete, we find the deepest truths. Even a missing slipper can be a teacher when we stop resisting and begin to pay attention. The next story is called The Fisherman Who Sang to the Carp. In a small mist-covered village, where the river curled like a silver ribbon through the mountains, there lived an old fisherman named Senzu. He was unlike the others. While they cast nets and shouted to the skies, Senzu never used a hook, nor bait, nor even a line. He came each morning at dawn, sat on a smooth stone near the water's edge, and sang not loudly, but softly, with a voice like wind through pine. Children laughed at him, and other fishermen mocked him. "You'll catch nothing but silence," they'd say, but Senzu only smiled and sang his quiet song, a gentle tune with no words, only feeling. One curious boy, Takumi, began to watch him day after day. Though Senzu never once cast a line, fish gathered near him. Carp with shimmering scales would glide close to the shore, circle the stone where he sat, and sometimes even rest in the shallow waters at his feet. He never took them home. He simply bowed and sang. Takumi couldn't contain his wonder any longer. "Why do they come to you?" he asked. "You offer nothing. No food, no trap. Just song." Senzu looked at him kindly. "Long ago," he said, "I came here with anger. I wanted to take, to win, to conquer the river. But no fish came. Only my frustration returned. Then one morning, after a great loss in my life, I came not to catch, but to grieve. I sang to the water without needing anything back. That's when they came. The fish could feel it. I had stopped needing and started being. He placed a hand on his chest. The river doesn't need to be forced, neither do people. When you are fully present, fully honest, without demand others, even the smallest creatures will feel it. They will come close, not because you took, but because you gave without wanting. Takumi stood still, watching the quiet ripples around the old man's feet. He did not speak. For the first time, he understood that listening was another kind of singing. Moral of the story: connection does not grow through force or need, it blossoms through presence. When we drop our expectations and offer our truth gently, the world responds. Like the carp to the fisherman's song, others are drawn not to our strength, but to our sincerity, stillness, and peace. The next story is called When the Bell Refused to Echo. In a quiet valley surrounded by pine-covered hills, there stood an ancient Zen temple with a great bronze bell at its heart. For centuries, the monks struck the bell at dawn to wake the valley and again at dusk to send peace into the night. Its deep, ringing tone echoed far across the mountains, reaching even the most distant villages. People said the bell's sound could calm even the most restless soul. One misty morning, a young monk named Kaoru was given the honor of striking the bell for the first time. His heart beat fast with excitement and nervous pride. He bowed, lifted the wooden mallet with both hands, and struck. But nothing happened. No sound rang out, just a hollow, dull, thud-like striking stone. The bell stood silent. Confused and embarrassed, Kaoru struck again, harder. Still, nothing. Other monks gathered, whispering. The bell had never been silent before. The abbot arrived and placed a hand gently on Kaoru's shoulder. "Come," the abbot said, "let us sit." They walked together to the meditation hall. The bell loomed behind them, unmoved, like a sleeping giant. Kaoru spoke first. "Master, I struck it as we were taught. Why did it not sound?" The abbot poured tea and answered softly, "The bell was not silent. You were not listening." Kaoru frowned. "But I heard nothing." The abbot pointed to Kaoru's chest. "You struck with effort, not presence. You desired sound, but the bell needed stillness. True echo is not made with force, but with clarity." He explained how the bell's sound depends not just on strength, but on the purity of the moment. If the mind is noisy, the bell will not sing. If the heart is tight, the echo cannot find space. That evening, Kaoru returned to the bell. This time, he stood in stillness, breathing with the earth. He let go of his wish to impress, his rush to perform. He bowed, raised the mallet, and gently struck. A deep, long tone spilled into the sky, rising like smoke, dissolving into the night. Moral of the story: the world does not always respond to force. Sometimes it waits for presence. When we let go of our need to control and instead act with true awareness, even silence will echo. What we seek from outside begins with what we hold within. The next story is called Shadows of the Bodhi Tree at Noon. The sun hung directly overhead, casting its sharpest light on the earth. At this hour, even the birds grew quiet, and the wind held its breath. Beneath the great Bodhi tree in the monastery garden, a young monk named Kiko sat in meditation, his shadow tucked tightly beneath him. He had chosen this hour with purpose. If enlightenment comes under the Bodhi tree, he had thought, then surely it must shine brightest when the sun is strongest. But as the heat pressed down and beads of sweat rolled down his neck, his thoughts grew tangled. Questions rose like smoke. Why do I still feel so restless? Why, under this sacred tree, at this sacred hour, does my heart feel no closer to peace? Frustrated, Kiko opened his eyes and looked at the ground. There it washes shadow, sharp and short, hugging him closely. It seemed to have nowhere else to go. An old monk approached, having watched from a distance. He stood quietly for a moment, then spoke. "Do you know why the noon shadow is the smallest?" Kiko looked up, unsure. The elder continued, "Because the light is directly above you. When the light is at its most intense, the shadow has no place to stretch. It hides, tight and silent, but it is still there." He knelt beside Kiko and gently touched the ground. Just because a shadow is small does not mean it has disappeared. Even at the hour of greatest light, there is still darkness within. You cannot escape it, not with time, not with effort, not even with sacred trees. The wind returned softly, rustling the Bodhi leaves. The old monk smiled. The Buddha found peace not by banishing his shadow, but by sitting with it, accepting it. Enlightenment isn't the end of darkness, it's the moment you stop running from it. Kiko looked again at his shadow, no longer annoyed by its presence. It was part of him, just quieter now, resting in the heat of awareness. He breathed deeply, not to change anything, but simply to be. Moral of the story: even in our brightest moments, shadows remain. But they are not to be feared, they are part of us. True peace is not found in eliminating darkness, but in learning to sit beside it without fear. Only then can light and shadow exist in harmony, like truth under the Bodhi tree at noon. The next story is called Rice Porridge and the Invisible Guest. In a quiet mountain temple where the wind carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, the monks lived by simple rhythm, seerely rising, silent chores, meditation, and humble meals. Among their daily customs was a large bowl of hot rice porridge served at dawn. Thick, warm, and plain, it was not a feast, but a comfort, prepared each morning by the head cook with care and mindfulness. One winter morning, snow fell heavily, blanketing the temple in silence. Inside the dining hall, the monks gathered as usual, sitting in rows, steam rising from their bowls like gentle clouds. But something was different. A novice monk named Ren noticed that, as always, one extra bowl had been placed at the far end of the table. It had no owner, yet it was always full, always waiting. Curious, Ren asked the head cook after the meal, "Why do we always prepare an extra bowl? No one ever comes to eat it." The cook smiled and said, "That bowl is not empty. It is for the guest we do not see." Ren looked confused. "But how can someone invisible eat? Isn't that just wasted food?" The cook wiped his hands on his robe and replied, "That bowl is for the part of us that often goes unseen, the forgotten, hurting, doubting self. The part we hide even from ourselves. We prepare that bowl with love, so we never forget. All beings, seen or unseen, within or without, deserve compassion." That night, as snow whispered against the temple roof, Ren sat alone and thought about the invisible guest. He saw for the first time the quiet pain he carried, the longing to belong, the fear of not being enough, the sadness he never spoke aloud. And then, in his heart, he offered that guest a bowl, not of porridge, but of kindness. The next morning, as the monks ate in silence, Ren glanced at the extra bowl and smiled. It was still full, but something inside him felt fed. Moral of the story: we all carry invisible guests' quiet needs, hidden grief, parts of ourselves that feel unworthy or alone. When we offer compassion even to what we cannot see, we begin to heal from within. No kindness is ever wasted, not even a bowl left untouched. The next story is called The Zen Master Who Painted with Ash. In a small mountain village where winter seemed to linger longer than it should, there lived a Zen master known not for his sermons, but for his paintings. Each morning, while others lit fires to keep warm, he would collect the ashes left behind, soft grey remains of yesterday's warm hand, carry them to his studio. He never used ink, never touched color, only ash. The villagers often watched him, puzzled. Why not use proper materials, they'd ask. Why paint with what's been burned away? But the master would only smile, dip his brush into the cool grey dust, and continue painting. His works were haunting fragile mountain ridges, wind-swept trees, empty roads. They held no vivid color, yet stirred something deep inside, like memories just beyond reach. One day, a young artist named Mika arrived from the city. She had heard of the master's work and traveled far to learn from him. When she saw the ash paintings up close, her heart ached with quiet wonder. "Master," she said, "your art is beautiful, but why use ash? Why something so dead?" The old master paused, then motioned for her to sit. He took a fresh brush, dipped it in a small bowl of ash, and painted a single falling leaf on parchment soft, crumbling, and weightless. "This," he said, "is not death. It is what remains when the fire is done speaking." He turned to her gently. "Ash holds the memory of what was, a tree, a home, a meal shared in silence. It is humble, easily forgotten, yet it carries every moment that led to its becoming. When I paint with it, I'm not decorating the present. I'm honoring what made it possible." Mika sat still, tears rising for reasons she couldn't name. She thought of her own losses, the things she tried to erase, cover, or forget. The master touched her hand and whispered, "Sometimes the most honest art is made from what we once tried to throw away." She nodded, understanding not just with her mind, but with her heart. Moral of the story: what feels broken, burned, or lost still holds quiet wisdom. In the ashes of our past lie the traces of every lesson, every love, every transformation. When we stop hiding what hurt us and begin to create from it, we discover that beauty can rise not despite the fire, but because of it. The next story is called Between the Breath and the Thought. In a small temple tucked beneath whispering cedar trees, there lived an old Zen master named Haku. His voice was soft, but his presence filled the room like still water fills a bowl. Monks came from faraway villages to learn from him, hoping to understand the way of peace. But Master Haku rarely gave answers. Instead, he gave silence. One morning, a young monk named Kaito approached him, eyes full of frustration. "Master," he said, "I sit in meditation every day, but my thoughts never stop. I breathe in and out, but the noise inside me is louder than ever. Am I failing?" Master Haku nodded gently, as if he had been waiting for the question. He motioned for Kaito to follow him into the garden. They walked slowly, the air crisp and still, the sound of wind chimes in the distance. Haku stopped beside a pond and pointed to the water's surface. It was rippling from a single falling leaf. "You see this?" he asked. "The surface moves, but beneath stillness. The mind is like this. On the surface, breath. Beneath it, thought. But between them, there is something else." Kaito looked puzzled. "Between the breath and the thought?" "Yes," Haku whispered. "There is a space, small, silent, a pause. It is not the breath, it is not the thought. It is the place where you are truly alive, untouched by past or future. That space is the doorway." Kaito sat by the pond that evening, watching the space between ripples, between wind gusts, between his own inhale and exhale. At first, it was barely there, just a flicker. But then, something opened. In that quiet space between breath and thought, he felt neither rushed nor lost. He simply was present, weightless, held by nothing and needing nothing. It was not an escape. It was a return. The next day, when he sat in meditation, the thoughts still came. But now, between each breath and each thought, he began to sense the stillness waiting there, patient, kind, unchanged. Moral of the story: peace is not the absence of thought or the perfection of breath. It is found in the space between them, the quiet moment where we are simply aware. In that small pause, we discover who we truly are. Not the thought, not the breath, but the stillness watching both. The next story is called The Ant Who Reached Nirvana. In a quiet garden just beyond the walls of an old monastery, the monks would often walk barefoot along winding stone paths. They would pause beneath plum trees, listen to the birds, and sometimes sit by the pond in still meditation. But few noticed the tiny world beneath their feet, a world of ants, moving in silence, carrying grains of rice, building, falling, starting again. One afternoon, as a group of monks sat in zazen near the pond, a young novice named Toma opened his eyes. His legs ached, his thoughts buzzed, and he felt more restless than serene. As he looked down in frustration, he saw a single ant crawling across his robe, circling, pausing, then continuing. Without thinking, he flicked it away. But an older monk sitting beside him opened one eye and whispered, "Be still, watch." Toma looked again. Another ant had appeared, this one moving slowly across the worn stones. It was missing a leg, yet continued forward with unwavering focus, carrying a tiny piece of leaf. Around it, larger ants rushed past, some slipping, some pushing, but this one moved in steady rhythm, step by careful step. The old monk leaned closer. "That ant," he said, "has returned every day for weeks. It has been crushed by storms, stepped on by careless feet, even lost its way. But it always returns. Not to conquer, not to win, but simply to walk. It asks for nothing, it resists nothing, it just is." Toma watched as the ant reached the edge of a stone, paused, then turned without panic and continued on a new path. The elder spoke again, softer this time. "Many think nirvana is for the great, for the wise, but the Buddha said it is for those who let go of clinging, anger, and illusion. That ant, in its silence and persistence, has let go more purely than many men ever do." Toma sat very still, no longer chasing peace, no longer fighting his thoughts, just watching, breathing, learning. And the ant, small, unnoticed by the world, carried its offering into the grass and disappeared, free. Moral of the story: Nirvana is not found in grand acts or perfect mindset, lives in the quiet surrender of the present. In the humble ant's journey, free of grasping and fear, we are reminded that peace comes not through force, but through being fully, simply, here. The next story is called Snowfall on the Empty Teacup. In the northern mountains, where winter wraps the world in white silence, there sat a small, weathered tea house beside a Zen temple. It was a humble Placino grand decorations, no gold or incense, just wooden floors, warm steam, and the quiet presence of old teacups that had passed through countless hands. One evening, as snow drifted softly from a pale sky, a young man named Hiroshi arrived at the tea house. He was not a monk, but a traveler, worn from life's weight. He had studied many books, chased many teachings, and visited countless masters, but still, his heart was heavy, his mind crowded. The old tea master, who moved slowly like a wind that had learned to rest, welcomed him with a bow and led him to a low table near the window. Without a word, he placed an empty teacup in front of Hiroshi and began preparing the tea. Hiroshi, restless, began to speak. "I've read the sutras. I've meditated for hours. I've walked pilgrimages, but peace still escapes me. My cup should be full by now, but it feels empty." The tea master said nothing. He poured hot tea into the cup until it was full, and then he kept pouring. The tea spilled over, steaming and spreading across the wooden table. "Stop," Hiroshi cried. "It's overflowing." The old man looked at him calmly. "Yes, like your mind." The snow fell more heavily outside, blanketing the garden in white silence. The tea master then emptied the cup, turned it upside down for a moment, then upright again. "Do you see?" he said softly. "A full cup can receive nothing. To taste the tea, you must first be empty." For the first time, Hiroshi sat without words. Snow tapped gently against the window, and the steam rose quietly between them. He looked into the empty teacup and realized it wasn't a failure to feel empty, it was the beginning. The space was ready, finally ready to be filled with something true. Moral of the story: an overflowing mind cannot hold wisdom. Only when we become empty of ego, of knowing, of noise can we receive what truly matters. Like fresh snow on still earth, peace settles only where there is space. The next story is called The Bamboo That Danced Without Wind. In a quiet valley where the mist moved like breath and time passed as slowly as falling snow, there stood a grove of bamboo unlike any other. The monks of a nearby temple often walked through it in silence, for something about the place made even their thoughts bow low. Among the tall green stalks, one bamboo stood apart. Not taller, not brighter, just different. The villagers whispered that it sometimes moved even when there was no breezes, swaying gently, as if dancing to music only it could hear. Some dismissed it as imagination, others as myth. But the monks knew better. A young monk named Ryan was sent to meditate in the grove for 30 days, a practice meant to help him soften his restless mind. But each day he grew more impatient. "I've come to listen," he whispered to the bamboo, "but all I hear is silence. Nothing changes, not even the wind moves." On the 14th day, rain fell gently, then stopped, leaving the air heavy and still. As Ryan sat beneath the familiar grove, something caught his eye. One stalk of bamboo was moving. Not much, just a slight, slow sway. The others stood still. No wind touched it, yet it moved, as if stirred from within. Ryan stood, heart suddenly stiller than his feet. He stepped closer, and for a moment the world narrowed to the rhythm of that single bamboo, swaying without reason, without force, without sound. That evening he asked the abbot, "Why did that bamboo move when no wind blew?" The abbot smiled, his eyes deep with quiet. "Not all motion comes from the outside," he said. "That bamboo is not dancing for the sky. It moves from what is inside, from the memory of rain, from the softness it carries after a storm. It has learned to move, even when the world stands still." Ryan sat long into the night, finally understanding that stillness was not the absence of motion, but the source of it. The bamboo had taught him not through words, but through being. Moral of the story: true peace is not waiting for perfect conditions. Like bamboo that dances without wind, harmony begins from within. When we stop looking for outside reasons to move, to grow, to heal, we discover the quiet rhythm already living in us, ready to sway, ready to rise. The next story is called The Scent Left Behind by Enlightenment. In a quiet forest monastery, surrounded by cypress trees and the hush of morning fog, there lived a monk named Jinan, who was known for never speaking of enlightenment, not in words, not in writings, not even in parables. While others debated teachings or chased awakening like something distant and glowing, Jinan swept the temple paths, tended the garden, and bowed to the wind. One afternoon, a younger monk named Sora approached him, frustrated and weary. "I have studied the sutras. I have fasted, prayed, sat in meditation for hours," he said. "But I feel nothing. I want to understand. I want to awaken. Please, tell me, what does enlightenment feel like?" Jinan did not answer. He only smiled and continued pruning the fragrant plum blossoms near the garden wall. Sora watched, confused and slightly annoyed. That evening, Jinan was nowhere to be found in the meditation hall. Sora wandered through the darkening temple grounds, searching. As he rounded the back path by the garden, He caught the faintest scent in the air, plum blossoms, soft and sweet, even though the flowers were gone. He followed the scent around the bend, where the breeze passed through the empty branches, brushing his face gently. Jinan sat nearby, his hands resting in his lap, eyes closed. Not meditating, just sitting, just breathing. Sora sat beside him without speaking. The scent lingered, delicate but undeniable. Not strong, not demanding, just there. In that moment, he understood. Enlightenment was not something loud or blinding. It was not a crown to wear or a prize to hold. It was a present so light. It left no footprint, but so true it left a trace behind. Like a scent after the wind has passed. Like warmth in a room just after someone kind has left. Jinan opened his eyes and said only one thing. "You noticed." Moral of the story. Enlightenment does not always arrive with thunder. It often comes quietly, like a scent on the wind, revealing its truth, only after it has passed. Its gift is not in what it shows, but in what it leaves behind. Stillness, kindness, and the simple ability to notice what is already here. The next story is called When Koan Became a River. Far in the north, where mountains wore white crowns and the air smelled of cedar and snow, there lived a wandering monk named Aisho. He carried with him only two things, a worn-out robe and a single koan, gifted by his master before he left the temple. It was simple, but impossible to answer. What is the sound of one hand clapping? For years, Aisho meditated on it. He repeated it with each breath, carved it into tree trunks, whispered it to the wind, but the answer never came. It haunted him, not like a ghost, but like an echo, just close enough to feel, yet never to grasp. Tired and defeated, Aisho settled near a river one spring morning. He had planned to meditate for a final time and then give up his search. He sat by the edge, watching the water slip past rocks, twigs, leaves, his own reflection. The river did not try to explain itself. It simply moved. For hours, he watched it, not thinking, not naming, just seeing. Suddenly, a leaf landed gently in the current and floated downstream. Aisho's breath caught. In that instant, the koan rose again in his mind, not as a riddle, but as the river itself. The sound of one hand clapping was not something to solve. It was this: the river flowing without resistance, the leaf surrendering without fear, the mountain holding the sky without asking questions. He began to laugh, not loudly, but like someone remembering a song they once knew as a child. All this time, he had searched for an answer made of words, forgetting that some truths do not speak. They move. The koan had never been a wall. It was a river. And to understand it, he did not need to cross either, only had to step in. Moral of the story. Not every question is meant to be answered with logic. Some truths must be felt not with the mind, but with the whole self. Like rivers, koans are not puzzles to be solved, but paths to be entered. When we stop demanding meaning and begin to simply witness, the answer appears not as a word, but as a flow. The next story is called The Mirror That Never Reflected. In a forgotten temple tucked between two cliffs, carved from stone and shadow, there was a room that few entered. Inside stood a mirror, round, silver, and completely smooth. Yet no one could see themselves in it. It gave back nothing, not a face, not a flicker. It was known as the mirror that never reflected. Many monks found it unsettling. What is the point of a mirror that shows nothing, they would say. Some believed it was broken, cursed, or simply a reminder of emptiness. It stood untouched for generations, gathering dust but never scratches, as though time itself hesitated to disturb it. One day, a monk named Tetsu, new to the temple and still caught in thoughts of achievement, fame, and identity, became curious. He had heard stories of monks finding truth in strange ways. and he believed the mirror held some secret that had not yet been unlocked. He entered the room in the early morning light, determined to uncover its meaning. He stared into it for hours, frowning. No image, not even his shadow. He waved his hands, moved side to side, nothing. Agitated, he shouted, "Who am I, if not even a mirror will show me?" An old monk passing by heard his voice and stepped inside. He smiled gently and said, "That mirror is not broken. It is perfectly clear." Tetsu turned to him, confused. "But it doesn't show anything." The old monk nodded. "Because it shows only what is, and most who look into it are full of what is not: names, roles, pasts, futures, stories. This mirror reflects nothing, because to truth, those things are nothing. When the self becomes silent, the mirror reveals everything." Tetsu looked back at the mirror. Still, no image. But now, instead of frustration, he felt stillness. The mirror did not lie. It simply refused illusion. He bowed deeply, not because he understood, but because something inside him had stopped needing to. Moral of the story: sometimes what we call emptiness is not absence, but honesty. When the mind is free from illusion and identity, even a mirror that reflects nothing can reveal everything. True clarity is not in what we see, but in what we no longer need to. The next story is called A Lantern Lit by No Hand. In the hills where fog draped the earth like silk and silence hung heavier than air, there stood a shrine carved into stone. Few visited it. No monks lived there. No incense was burned. And yet, inside its single chamber, a lantern glowed each night softly, steadily, though no one had ever seen it lit. Travelers spoke of it with reverence and wonder, calling it the lantern lit by no hand. Some claimed it was a miracle. Others dismissed it as a tale meant to stir the heart, but not the mind. Still, one young monk named Kaito could not let go of the story. He had been training for years, reciting sutras, mastering rituals, seeking answers in scriptures, but nothing had ever stirred his soul like the image of that untouched light. One winter morning, he set out to find the shrine. Snow fell lightly, muffling the world in stillness. He walked for days, through frozen woods and silent valleys, driven not by proof, but by something deeper longing. When he arrived at the stone shrine, the sun had nearly set. The cold bit into his skin, but his heart beat warm with anticipation. He stepped inside, breath-catching. There it was, the lantern. It was not ornate, it was not gold, just plain wood and glass, ancient and worn. But it glowed. No flame, no smoke, just light. He sat before it, trembling not from cold, but from something sacred. He waited through the night, eyes wide, expecting a trick, a clue, a reason. None came. At dawn, he whispered, "How can you shine without a hand to light you?" And in that silence, the answer did not speak, yet it filled him. The lantern did not need to be lit because it was never unlit. The light was not fuel, not flame. It was being itself, unforced, unasked, undone. In that moment, Kaito realized, some lights in this world are not sparked. They are revealed when we finally stop trying to ignite them. Moral of the story: true wisdom, like a lantern lit by no hand, does not come from effort alone. It arises not from force, but from stillness when the seeking quiets and the self steps aside. Some lights live within us always, waiting not to be lit, but to be seen. The next story is called The Cat Who Meditated Under Plum Trees. In the gardens of a peaceful Zen temple, where soft wind carried the scent of old plum blossoms, there lived a stray cat. No one knew where it came from or when it arrived. It simply appeared one spring morning and never left. The monks named her Mizu, and she wandered the grounds like a silent guest, asking for nothing, resting wherever the sunlight fell. At first, the monks ignored her, thinking she would eventually move on. But she didn't. Each day, she returned to the same spot beneath the plum trees, curling herself into a tight circle and sitting motionless for hours. Not sleeping, not alert. Just still like a pebble in a stream, unmoved by the current. One day, a young monk named Ryota sat nearby, curious and restless. He had been struggling with meditation for weeks. His legs ached, his thoughts ran wild, and his heart was filled with doubt. He looked at the cat and whispered, "How do you sit so still without effort? I try and fail. I breathe and still feel nothing." Mizu did not move. Day after day, Ryota returned, watching the cat. She never looked at him, never responded, but her presence was like a mirror, soft, silent, and completely unconcerned. She sat whether the wind blew or not. She sat whether the blossoms bloomed or fell. No teacher, no method, just being. Then, one morning, as petals drifted down like snow, Ryota finally stopped trying. He let go of his posture, his breath count, his self-doubt. He sat beside the cat with no goal, just to sit, like her, and in that stillness, something opened. Not dramatic, not loud, just peace, steady and unshaken, like the earth beneath them. The cat blinked once, as if to say, "Now you see," and closed her eyes again. From that day forward, Ryota understood. Meditation was not something to force, but something to return to, like a cat returning to her favorite patch of sun, again and again, without question. Moral of the story: peace comes not from effort, but from presence. Like the cat beneath the plum trees, true stillness asks for nothing, proves nothing, and waits for no one. When we stop striving and simply sit with life, calmness finds us on its own. The next story is called The Dust on the Buddha's Toe. In the heart of a peaceful monastery stood a great stone statue of the Buddha, tall, calm, weathered by time. Pilgrims came from far away to bow before it, lay flowers at its feet, and whisper prayers into its silence. Its face, worn smooth by wind and reverence, looked always serene. But it was the toes low to the ground, nearly hidden, that collected the most dust. One day, a novice monk named Ren was assigned a task: to clean the statue. Eager and proud, he climbed up with a cloth and polished the Buddha's forehead, his shoulders, even his hands, with great care. He stepped back to admire the glow of his work until the abbot quietly approached and pointed to the feet. "You forgot the toes," the abbot said. Ren blinked, confused. "But no one sees them," he replied. "They're low to the ground, dirty. Who would notice?" The abbot bent slowly, his old knees cracking, and wiped the thick dust from the Buddha's toe. "Exactly," he said. "That is why it matters." He looked at Ren with kind but steady eyes. "The world teaches us to shine in places where we'll be seen, but the Dharma asks us to serve where no one is looking. Enlightenment does not rise from being admired, it rises from humility." Ren knelt beside the abbot, suddenly ashamed of his pride. "But how can something as small as dust mean anything?" he asked. The abbot smiled and let the dust fall through his fingers. "This dust is the world. It clings to everything. And yet, the Buddha remains unmoved, still offering his presence. Even covered in the earth's weight, he does not reject it. He carries it." As Ren gently wiped the toes clean, he noticed how the light caught them, just slightly, quietly, like grace arriving without sound. That evening, no one mentioned his work, no one praised him. But Ren felt something new inside him, lighter, steadier, truer. He had touched the part of the Buddha that bore the world's weight, and in doing so, something in him had shifted. Moral of the story: greatness is not found in the places others applaud, it lives in quiet service, in unnoticed moments. The dust on the Buddha's toe teaches us that the path to peace is not in rising above the world, but in bowing gently to it, and in cleaning even what no one sees, with love. The next story is called How the Raindrop Bowed to the Ocean. In a soft grey sky just before dawn, a single raindrop formed clear, round, and trembling with the weight of its own smallness. It had never known land, nor sky, nor sea. It only knew that it was falling, slowly, through the mist. As it dropped from the clouds, the raindrop wondered aloud, "What am I? Where will I go? Will I disappear?" The wind whispered gently, "You are water, just as I am air. You fall not to vanish, but to become." The raindrop did not understand, but it trusted the fall. It passed through branches, catching the reflection of the sun rising behind leaves. It danced for a moment on a blade of grass, then rolled, unnoticed, into a flowing stream. The stream carried it with thousands of others. Some were loud, rushing ahead. Some clung to stones, afraid to move. The raindrop remained quiet, unsure of its place. Along the way, it asked the stream, "What is waiting for us?" The stream replied, "The ocean, the place we return to. But to reach it, we must stop holding ourselves apart." As the stream joined a wide river, and the river opened into the vastness of the sea, the raindrop felt fear. "If I enter the ocean," it whispered, "will I still be me?" A wave rose to greet it, gentle and ancient. "No," said the wave, "you will not be you in the way you once were, but you will not be lost. You will be part of everything." The raindrop paused at the edge of the shore, trembling with surrender. Then, with grace, it bowed not out of defeat, but devotion, and slipped silently into the sea. And in that moment, it did not vanish. It expanded. No longer just a drop, it became the ocean's breath, its rhythm, its rising tide. It had not disappeared, it had come home. Moral of the story: when we let go of our fear of losing ourselves, we discover a deeper belonging. Like the raindrop bowing to the ocean, surrender is not the end of identity, but the beginning of unity. True peace comes when we realize we are not apart from the whole, we are part of it. The next story is called A Feather's Silence in the Zendo. The Zendo was silent. It always was, especially before dawn, when even the crickets paused and the world held its breath. Within those wooden walls, the monks sat still, wrapped in their robes like stones beside a river. Nothing moved except the mind. One young monk named Izamu sat with clenched jaw and a heart full of noise. His thoughts raced about, a word left unsaid, a mistake from the day before, a future he could not shape. Though the room was silent, his mind screamed louder with every breath. He sat trying to crush the noise with stillness, trying to meditate perfectly, but the stillness became a cage. Just as he was about to rise in frustration, something delicate happened. From the small opening in the ceiling, a single white feather floated down. No one moved. The feather turned in the air slowly, then gently landed on the tatami mat in front of him. That feather held no weight, no message, no force. But Isamu stared at it, breath caught. Its descent had been so silent, so gentle, that it had not disturbed even a single grain of dust. It was as if the silence itself had offered him a lesson. After morning sitting, the old Roshi approached and saw Isamu still staring at the feather. Without asking, the Roshi sat beside him and whispered, "You are not the storm, Isamu. You are the sky it passes through." Isamu blinked slowly. The Roshi continued, "You tried to force silence like one forces a stone to float. But real stillness is not Madet is remembered. It's already within you, light as this feather. It comes not when you demand it, but when you allow it." He gently picked up the feather and placed it in Isamu's open palm. "That feather touched the Zendo without a sound," he said, "and yet it taught more than 1,000 chants." Isamu looked down. The feather lay perfectly still, and for the first time in days, so did his mind. Moral of the story: true silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of peace. Like a feather falling in still air, wisdom arrives not through force, but through soft surrender. When we stop struggling to silence the mind, we begin to hear what it has been whispering all along. The next story is called The Blind Monk's Paper Cranes. In a quiet village surrounded by rice fields and slow rivers, there lived an old blind monk named Shin. He had once traveled widely, teaching Dharma across distant lands. But now he spent his days in a small room beside the temple, folding paper cranes with hands that moved like water. No one knew why he made them. His eyes could no longer see the folds, nor the patterns on the paper. Yet every morning, after meditation, he sat cross-legged on the floor and folded a single crane, slowly and with care, then placed it on the windowsill to face the wind. Children whispered that the cranes could fly on their own. Others believed each one carried a prayer, but Shin never explained. He simply smiled, as if holding a secret too quiet for words. One afternoon, a young boy named Ren came to the temple with tears in his eyes. His father had died that spring, and since then, Ren had not spoken a word to anyone. The monks gave him food, comfort, and silence, but it was the blind monk who truly saw him. Shin invited Ren to sit beside him. Without speaking, he placed a square of paper in the boy's small hands. Slowly, gently, they began to fold together crease by crease, breath by breath. The room was filled with the soft rustle of paper and the steady rhythm of two hearts remembering how to feel. When the crane was finished, Shin touched Ren's shoulder and said quietly, "You don't need to see the paper, just feel it becoming." Ren whispered his first words in weeks, "But it's not perfect." Shin smiled, "Neither am I, but still the crane flies." From then on, Ren came every day. He folded cranes, not to fix his sorrow, but to hold it softly, tenderly. The windowsill filled with them. One morning, a breeze lifted a single crane from the ledge. It fluttered into the sky and vanished. Shin bowed in its direction. "That one carried your voice," he said. Moral of the story: healing doesn't always come through understanding, but through gentle acts of presence. Like the blind monk's cranes, peace can be folded from silence and pain. And even when broken, we can still create something that flies. The next story is called When Samsara Wore a Smile. In a crowded marketplace, full of voices and clattering carts, incense smoke and sun-warmed dust, there lived a woman named Aiko who sold clay cups. Day after day, she shaped the earth with her hands, fired it with care, and laid her creations in neat rows. Her stall was small, her life simple, yet something in her eyes always seemed to shimmer with quiet joy. One morning, a monk passed by, returning from a pilgrimage that had left him weary in both body and soul. He had spent years trying to escape samsarathi, endless cycle of birth, death, suffering, and rebirth. He had wandered far, seeking places untouched by craving, untouched by pain. And yet, he still felt trapped within his own mind. Drawn by Aiko's gentle smile, the monk paused at her stall. She offered him tea in one of her cups, roof at the edges, warm in the hands. They sat together as the noise of the world continued around them, unnoticed. "You seem at peace," he said finally, "yet you live in the middle of all this chaos." Aiko laughed softly. "Yes, I live in the middle of samsara." The monk furrowed his brow. "But how can you smile in a place filled with desire, with impermanence, with suffering?" She looked at him kindly, holding up one of her cups. "Every cup I make breaks one day," she said. "Some fall, some crack with heat, some are taken by strangers who never return. But I still make them. I still pour tea, not because they last, but because they're here." She set the cup down gently. "Samsara is not a curse if you stop fighting it. It's only painful when we demand it be something else. But when you accept its noise, its changes, Its breaking it becomes almost beautiful, even tender. The monk sat in silence, the scent of tea rising between them. In her words, he heard something he hadn't felt in years, not escape, not detachment, but freedom within the world, not away from it. He took another sip and smiled back. Moral of the story: peace is not found by escaping the world, but by seeing it clearly and embracing it as it is. When we stop resisting the impermanence of life, samsara no longer binds you, it bows to us, and sometimes even wears a smile. The next story is called The Silence That Swept the Monastery. There was once a monastery hidden deep in the mountains, where seasons passed gently and the wind spoke more often than the monks. It was a place of stillness, known not for its chants or its teachings, but for a silence so complete that it felt alive. Travelers who passed through would often pause at the gates, unsure if they were entering a temple or a dream. One winter, a young monk named Anzu arrived. He had been trained in many places, learned countless sutras, and practiced meditation with intense effort. But he was restless. He had come to this monastery hoping to reach enlightenment. Instead, he found nothing. No lectures, no debates, not even instruction. Just sweeping floors, tending gardens, and silence so deep it echoed in his chest. After weeks of stillness, Anzu approached the abbot and asked with frustration, "Why does no one speak? How will I learn if nothing is taught?" The abbot, an old man with kind eyes and no hurry, looked up from raking leaves and replied, "The silence teaches what words never can, but only when you stop trying to hear it." Anzu frowned. "But I listen every day. I strain to hear something, anything." The abbot smiled and placed the rake gently aside. "And that is why you hear nothing." That night, as snow began to fall and the temple grew even quieter than usual, Anzu sat in the meditation hall alone. He stopped trying. He didn't force stillness. He didn't chase thoughts away. He just let the silence be what it was. In the hush, he noticed things he hadn't before: the creak of old wood, the rhythm of his breath, the way the air felt heavier with snow. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of life, of presence, of listening itself. He wept, not from sadness, but from a strange joy that felt older than his name. It was the joy of returning to something that had always been there. From then on, he swept the temple halls with care, not to clean, but to listen to, let the silence sweep him. Moral of the story: true understanding doesn't always come through sound or speech, but through surrender. When we stop searching and allow silence to enter us fully, we discover it's not emptiness, it's presence. The silence that sweeps the world clean can also sweep the heart clear. The next story is called The Inkstone That Cried at Dawn. In a monastery tucked between mountains and mist, there lived an aging calligrapher named Master Shun. For decades, he wrote morning sutras with delicate kari, his brush moving like breath, his strokes steady and full of presence. He never missed a dawn. Each day, before the bell rang, he would grind ink on his beloved inkstone, the same one he had used since he was a novice. It was a simple object, black, heavy, and smooth, with use, but to Master Shun, it held memory. Every word he had written, every prayer he had whispered, had passed through that stone. It was more than a tool. It was a witness. One cold morning, as the sky softened into light, Master Shun reached for the inkstone, but his hands trembled. His strength was fading with age, and the inkstone slipped from his grasp. It struck the floor and cracked down the middle. A long silence followed. Monks gathered quietly, unsure what to say. Some expected him to weep, others waited for anger. But Master Shun simply knelt and touched the broken stone with 2 fingers, gently tracing the crack like the line of a tear. One young monk stepped forward, voice shaking. "Master, It's broken. It can no longer hold ink. Should we offer you a new one?" But the master only smiled and whispered, "This inkstone has given all it could. Even in breaking, it teaches." He placed it back on the table, and for the first time in many years, he did not write. Instead, he sat in silence and watched the sun rise through the paper walls, the light pouring in like gold. A soft mist curled from his tea. Birds began to sing. The broken inkstone, no longer grinding ink, now held something else: stillness. Its fracture shimmered slightly in the morning light, and some said it looked like it had wept, not in sorrow, but in surrender. Moral of the story: even what is broken can hold beauty. When we stop clinging to what once was and accept what now is, we find that some of life's most tender truths are revealed, not in perfection, but in the quiet grace of things falling apart. What cannot write may still teach, what cracks may still shine. The next story is called Lotus Root Beneath the Ice. In a northern village, where the winters were long and the lakes froze thick and silent, there stood a small temple by the water's edge. During summer, the monks would meditate beside the lotus pond, watching the flowers rise from the mud in soft pink blooms. But in winter, the pond vanished beneath a sheet of hard ice, still and white as porcelain. To the eye, it looked empty, lifeless. One day, a young monk named Toma sat by the frozen pond, troubled. He had felt numb for weeks. His prayers felt hollow, his mind dull, his heart heavy without reason. He turned to the old abbot beside him and confessed, "Master, I feel nothing. No joy, no peace. It's as if the path has vanished beneath me." The abbot said nothing. Instead, he walked to the edge of the ice and tapped his staff gently against its surface. The sound echoed a hollow knock, like calling on a locked door. Then he turned to Toma and asked, "Do you think the lotus root is gone because the flower is not seen?" Toma shook his head slowly. "No, it's hidden beneath the ice." The abbot nodded. "Yes, in the coldest months, the lotus root sleeps beneath the surface. It does not bloom, it does not rise, but it remains alive, whole, waiting. Your heart is like this in times of stillness. Just because you do not feel peace does not mean it is lost." Toma stared into the pale sheet of ice, and for the first time he noticed what was beneath it: not darkness, but shape, the soft, shadowed outline of the lotus root still resting below. The abbot sat beside him and whispered, "Patience is part of awakening. Some seasons do not bloom, but they prepare the ground for what will come." Toma felt no sudden warmth, no miracle, but a small, steady peace began to return like a whisper under snow. Moral of the story: just because something is not seen or felt does not mean it has disappeared. Like the lotus root beneath the ice, our strength, clarity, and peace often rest quietly, waiting for the right season to rise. In stillness, there is not failure, but quiet becoming. The next story is called The Day the Bodhisattva Laughed. In a forest temple surrounded by flowering plum trees, the monks were known for their strict silence and serious practice. They walked like shadows, spoke only in ritual phrases, and treated every moment with sacred gravity. Among them was a statue of a bodhisattva, seated with perfect posture, gaze soft, lips carved in eternal stillness. No one had ever seen a smile in that temple, let alone laughter. One day, a wandering monk named Haku arrived. He was dusty, light-footed, and humming a tune. He bowed respectfully, but with a brightness in his eyes that unsettled the solemn atmosphere. During meditation, he smiled. During work, he hummed. When a bowl dropped and shattered, he laughed not loudly, but kindly, as if even the brokenness had purpose. The senior monks grew uneasy. They whispered, "Is he mocking the path? Is joy a distraction from awakening? Is laughter disrespect?" Finally, the abbot approached him under the bodhisattva's gaze. "Why do you smile so much?" he asked, his voice calm but tight. "Don't you see the suffering of this world?" Haku nodded. "I see it, every day. But I also see the beauty that lives beside it. The sunlight on old stone, the way tea steam rises like prayer, a child laughing in the distance. Is awakening only sorrow? Can we not bow with joy?" The abbot remained silent. Just then, a breeze passed through the temple. The bodhisattva statue, long thought unchanging, let loose a soft crack. A small chip of stone from the corner of its mouth fell to the ground, and beneath it, barely noticeable, was the faintest curve of a smile. The monks stared in silence. Haku bowed to the statue, tears in his eyes. "There it is," he whispered. "The smile beneath the stillness. The compassion that knows sorrow and joy are not opposites but twins." No one spoke, but later that evening, a sound not heard in decades rose from the zendo laughter. Gentle, warm, free, like a bell that had forgotten its own voice. Moral of the story: enlightenment is not the absence of feeling, it is the full embrace of life. A bodhisattva does not close their heart to suffering, but opens it wide enough to include laughter. True wisdom knows that even joy can be sacred, and sometimes the path to awakening begins with a smile. The next story is called Chant of the Broken Mala Beads. In a monastery perched on the edge of a dense forest, a place where fog curled like smoke through the trees, the monks greeted each day with prayer and silence. Each carried a Malawan 108 beads strung together to mark their chants. The beads were not jewels, but simple wood, worn smooth by years of use. They were sacred, not because they were perfect, but because they held the rhythm of devotion. Among the monks was a quiet man named Eiji, known for his steady heart and clear chanting. Every morning before sunrise, he sat under the Bodhi tree near the temple gate and whispered ancient words, his mala passing through his fingers like a river of memory. But one morning, just before the first chant began, the string of his mala snapped. Beads spilled across the stone path, bouncing into the grass and cracks between the stones. Eiji froze. Around him, the others continued their prayers, unaware. He gathered the beads slowly, but one was missing. No matter how long he searched, it was gone. The next day, Eiji returned to the tree without his mala. He folded his hands and began to chant, voice soft but uncertain. It felt wrong, incomplete, like a door had been left open. The head monk, old and kind, sat beside him. "Why do you hesitate?" he asked. "My mala is broken," Eiji replied. "And one bead is lost. The count is wrong. My chant feels broken too." The old monk smiled. "Do you think the Buddha waits for the right number, or that truth listens only when the words are perfect?" Eiji looked down. The monk picked up a small, mismatched bead from his own pouch and placed it in Eiji's palm. "Use this one, or don't. Let the chant carry what's in your heart, not what's in your hand." That evening, Eiji strung the beads back together, missing one from the original but gaining one gifted with compassion. When he chanted the next morning, his voice trembled not from doubt, but from something deeper. It wasn't perfect, but it was whole. Moral of the story: perfection is not the path presence is. When what we hold breaks, we are given the chance to touch the heart of our practice. Even broken beads can carry prayers. And the deepest chants are the ones that rise from the space between what was lost and what remains. The next story is called Zen Master's Forgotten Mantra. There once was a revered Zen master named Tenji, known far and wide for the mantra he chanted each morning at sunrise. Disciples came from distant provinces to hear it not for the sound, but for the feeling it left behind. Stillness, clarity, peace. No one knew exactly what the words meant. They were ancient, passed from teacher to teacher, never written down. One winter morning, as snow blanketed the temple roofs and smoke curled from chimneys like faded prayers, Tenji stood before his students in the meditation hall. The incense was lit, the bell was struck, and all eyes turned toward him. But something strange happened. He opened his mouth, and nothing came. The mantra, his sacred thread, his daily compass, was gone. A wave of silence passed over the hall. Some students looked confused, others concerned. Tenji stood still, his gaze soft but uncertain. He searched his memory, but the words had vanished like snow melting on warm stone. After several long moments, he bowed and walked out without speaking. The students were shaken. "If even the master forgets the mantra," one whispered, "what hope is there for us?" The next day, Tenji did not return to the hall, nor the day after. On the third day, a young monk named Aya found him sitting alone by the koi pond, watching the ripples shift with the breeze. She approached quietly, then knelt beside him. "Master," she said gently, "have you remembered the mantra?" He smiled, not with shame, but with a strange peace. "No," he said, "and that is the greatest teaching it ever gave me." Aya's eyes widened. Tenji continued, "All these years I thought the mantra carried the silence, but I see no, it was the silence that carried the mantra. When the words left me, I was afraid. But in that emptiness, I found something deeper than meaning. I found presence." He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the still water. The true mantra was never in the sound, it was in the space the sound created. From that day on, he no longer chanted. He simply sat with his students each morning, wordless and still, and somehow the peace only grew. Moral of the story: sometimes we hold too tightly to words, thinking they are the path. But when they fall away, what remains is truth. The deepest wisdom does not live in mantras, it lives in the silence they leave behind. When the words are gone, the teaching begins. The next story is called A Stone That Dreamed of Emptiness. In the quiet courtyard of a windswept Zen temple, there lay a single stone, large, unmoving, weathered by sun, rain, and the footsteps of countless monks. It had no name, no marking, no importance. To most, it was just a stone, but the old monks often said, half in jest, that this stone was dreaming. Not of mountains, not of the river, not of being a bird or tree. They said the stone dreamed of emptiness. One curious novice named Riku, young and full of questions, would sit by the stone each afternoon, trying to feel what the stone might feel. He would press his hands to its rough surface and whisper, "What does emptiness mean to a thing that cannot move?" He wanted answers. He wanted awakening. But all the stone gave him was silence. One day, frustrated by his own noisy thoughts, Riku went to the abbot and asked, "Why do you say the stone dreams of emptiness? How can something so heavy, so solid, dream of something so invisible?" The abbot, seated beside a mossy wall, looked up at the grey sky and said softly, "Emptiness is not nothingness. It is space within, space between. The stone is solid, yes, but it carries the memory of the mountain it once belonged to. It sits still, yet holds the sky on its back, the wind in its cracks. It does not seek, it simply is." Riku blinked. "But how is that a dream?" The abbot smiled. "Because even the stone has surrendered all need to become, and that surrender is the deepest peace." That evening, Riku returned to the courtyard. He sat beside the stone and didn't ask it anything. He didn't touch it. He didn't try to understand. He simply breathed. For a brief, quiet moment, his thoughts stilled, not because he forced them to, but because he stopped chasing. And in that stillness, he felt it, not a voice, not a vision, but the presence of something vast and quiet and kind. Maybe that was the dream the stone held, or maybe that silence was his own. Moral of the story: Emptiness is not the absence of life, but the space in which it unfolds. Like the stone that asks nothing and becomes everything, we find peace not through answers, but through surrender. In stillness, even the heaviest things can dream. The next story is called Leaves That Chose Not to Fall. In a quiet village where the seasons moved gently and the winds knew the names of trees, there stood a single maple that did not behave like the others. While the forest around it shed its colors in brilliant reds and golds, this tree held on. Even in the late days of autumn, when frost kissed the earth and birds began their long flight south, its leaves remained faded, trembling, but still clinging to the branches. Many saw it and found it strange. It resists the rhythm, they said. It holds on too long. But the monks from the hill temple saw something else. One evening, as the sky deepened into soft gray and the world prepared for winter's hush, a young monk named Sora sat beneath that stubborn tree. He had been struggling with grief. His father had passed in the spring, and though months had passed, the weight had not. Others told him to let go, to move on, to shed the sorrow like the trees shed their leaves. But he could not. He sat there, eyes lifted to the leaves above him, some curled, some dry, all clinging silently to branches that swayed but did not shake them loose. He whispered as if to the tree, "Why do you still hold on?" The temple abbot, who had followed him quietly, sat beside him. They watched the branches dance in the cold light of dusk. "Some trees let go early," the abbot said. "Some late, and some wait until they are truly ready. Their time is not disorder, it is devotion. What looks like resistance may be reverence." Sora looked at the old monk, tears rising in his eyes. "Letting go," the abbot continued, "is not something we force, it is something that ripens. These leaves will fall when the wind, the tree, and the moment agree. And you will let go, not when others say so, but when your heart no longer needs to hold." The wind passed gently through the maple, and one leaf, only one, drifted slowly down, soft as breath, honest as time. Moral of the story: grief has its own season. Healing does not follow a schedule. Like the leaves that choose not to fall, we are allowed to hold on until we are ready. And when release comes, it comes not with pressure, but with peace. Letting go is not an act of force, it is an act of love. The next story is called The Deer Who Asked About Karma. In the golden hush of late afternoon, the forest around the monastery shimmered with sunlight and falling leaves. Monks often wandered the woods after meditation, gathering herbs, listening to birdsong, and breathing with the rhythm of trees. But there was one visitor they never disturb, a young deer with soft eyes and slender legs, who came often and left quietly. She was not tame, yet she was not afraid. The monks named her Komyo, meaning radiant light. One autumn day, as the wind turned cold and the air smelled of dry pine, the deer approached a solitary monk named Ishin, who was sitting beneath a large cedar in silence. She stood in front of him, close enough that he could see the breath rising from her nose, the stillness in her eyes. And in the way of sacred things, the deer spoke not in words, but in presence. Her gaze asked a question: why must we suffer for things we don't understand? Why does karma follow us like a shadow, even when we try to be good? Ishin did not answer right away. He simply bowed his head in respect to the unspoken weight behind the question. Then, softly, he said, "When you walk through the grass, it bends. Even if you didn't mean to, your hooves leave a path. Karma is like that path, not punishment, not reward, just the shape left behind by each step." The deer tilted her head slightly, listening. Ishin continued, "Sometimes the grass grows back right away. Other times it stays pressed for days. It depends on the ground, the season, the softness of the step, but no step disappears. The wind rustled the trees above them. Leaves drifted down like thoughts that had lost their weight. The monk reached into his robe and offered a small apple. The deer stepped forward, gently took it, and stood beside him a while longer. Then, without sound, she walked back into the trees, leaving only hoofprints behind, faint but clear. Moral of the story: karma is not a punishment, but a footprint, subtle and lasting. Every choice, even unspoken, shapes the path behind and ahead. When we walk with awareness, with gentleness, the path becomes one of compassion, not consequence. Even in silence, the heart leaves a trail. The next story is called Kettle Whistle. At the moment of Satori. The temple kitchen was always quiet before dawn, lit only by the soft glow of coals and the low breath of boiling water. It was here that old monk Jiro spent most of his timino, in the meditation hall or the scripture room, but among vegetables, rice pots, and tea kettles. His hands were worn, his steps slow, but his presence was as steady as the rising sun. Young monks often overlooked him. To them, he was the cook, humble, background, ordinary. But some said that long ago, Jiro had been a great Zen teacher, one who had spoken koans like thunder and brought students to tears with a single gaze. When asked why he had given up teaching, Jiro would only smile and stir the miso. One restless morning, a monk named Renshin came into the kitchen, agitated after a long night of failed meditation. "I've read every sutra, I've sat for hours, I've chased every koan to its end," he muttered, rubbing his temples. Still no satori, no awakening, only silence. Jiro poured tea without looking up. "Then perhaps," he said softly, "you've been chasing silence too loudly." Renshin laughed bitterly. "And what do you know of satori? You haven't taught in years." Jiro didn't reply. He simply set the iron kettle on the stove and waited. They sat in silence. The fire crackled. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and slow. Minutes passed. The kettle began to hum. Renshin stared into the steam, frustration tightening his chest. "I've given everything, my time, my effort, my pride. Why hasn't it come?" Just as the kettle began to whistle sharp, piercing, alive, Jiro whispered, "There it is." Renshin blinked. "What?" "The whistle," Jiro said. "The moment it began, did your mind stop?" Renshin opened his mouth, then closed it. He realized he had stopped thinking entirely. The sound had pierced through him, not like noise, but like truth. Jiro smiled faintly. "Satori doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives when you finally stop demanding it, when you are simply here. Even a kettle knows this." Moral of the story: awakening is not found through force, but through stillness that listens. When the mind stops grasping, even the whistle of a kettle becomes a bell of realization. Satori does not always come in silence, it sometimes sings in steam. The next story is called When the Bodhi Tree Blossomed in Winter. In the courtyard of an ancient temple, there stood a Bodhi tree, wide, limbed, patient, and deeply rooted in centuries of stillness. It was said to be grown from a cutting of the very tree under which the Buddha awakened. Monks swept its fallen leaves with reverence, bowed before it each morning, and left offerings at its base, though it never bloomed. Bodhi trees are not known for their flowers. Seasons came and went. The tree gave shade in summer, shelter in rain, and stood bare in the cold. But one year, just as the earth froze and the wind carried the sharp scent of snow, something changed. On a quiet morning in early winter, a young monk named Tenzin approached the tree with heavy steps. He had been struggling in his practice, his heart filled with doubt, his mind like a field of stones. He sat beneath the Bodhi tree and whispered, "Why does awakening feel so far? I've done everything right. I've followed every rule, but still I feel empty." He lowered his head, thinking no one nothing was listening. Then, as if drawn by his surrender, a single blossom opened on the Bodhi tree. It was pale, delicate, and entirely out of season. The monks gasped when they saw it. Some wept. No one had ever seen such a thing. In the dead of winter, when the earth sleeps and even the wind feels brittle, the tree had offered a flower. The abbot came to see it and stood in silence. He looked at Tenzin with soft eyes and said, "Sometimes, only in winter can the soul become quiet enough to receive what spring cannot teach. This blossom is not a reward, it is a reminder. Awakening does not come when everything is warm and easy. It comes when you stop reaching for it." Tenzin looked up at the flower, trembling in the cold air, and smiled not because he had found what he was looking for, but because he no longer needed to. Moral of the story: true awakening often arrives not in times of abundance, but in the stillness of our inner winter. When we stop striving and simply sit with what is, even the barest tree may surprise us. The blossom comes not because we force it, but because we are finally still enough to witness it. The next story is called The Enlightenment of a Droplet. High in the mist-veiled cliffs of a forgotten valley, a single drop of water clung to the tip of a leaf. Morning light caught its fragile body, and the entire sky clouds, sun, and wind seemed to rest inside it. Around it, the forest stirred, birds called, leaves rustled, but the droplet did not move. It simply waited. Below, a stream wound its way between stones and moss, singing a soft, endless song. This stream had once been the same mountain mist, the same leaf drop, now racing toward rivers, toward oceans, toward the unseen beyond. One day, a young monk named Daigo hiked alone through this valley, deep in grief and confusion. He had been chasing enlightenment for years, through teachers, scriptures, fasts, and vows, but always felt like he was grasping at smoke. He came to the valley not to find answers, but to collapse into stillness. As he paused to rest, he looked up and saw the droplet. Something in its stillness held him. It wasn't just water, it was presence, balanced, quiet. It hung not out of fear nor pride, but because that was where it needed to be. It did not cling nor fall, it just was. Daigo sat beneath it, unmoving. Minutes passed, then an hour. The sun grew warmer, a breeze stirred the air, and at last, flipped the droplet, let go. It fell with no resistance, no hesitation, just surrender. It touched a stone, shimmered for a breath, and vanished into the earth. Daigo felt something inside him unravel. He whispered, "That was it." Not a flash of light, not a sacred chant, just a droplet, resting until it no longer needed to, falling without fear, returning to what it had always been a part of. The droplet had shown him everything: impermanence, non-attachment, the nature of self. It had become nothing, and in doing so, had become everything. Moral of the story: enlightenment is not always a thunderclap. Sometimes it is a single drop releasing its hold. When we stop clinging and allow ourselves to simply fall into now, into truth, into being, we realize we were never separate. Like the droplet, we are already whole. The next story is called Bamboo Shoots and the Silent Ordination. In a remote village nestled between mist-covered hills, a tiny Zen temple stood where wild bamboo grew thick and tall. The temple had no grand gates, no golden statues in the open air, worn sandals at the door, and the sound of wind sliding through leaves like whispered prayer. Among the monks was a young man named Kenta, who had never been formally ordained. He swept the grounds, prepared meals, and sat in silence with the others. But he wore no robe, held no title, and received no ceremony. Still, his devotion was deep and without question. He never asked for ordination, though many wondered why. One spring morning, new bamboo shoots began to rise through the soil along the temple, path soft, green, and fragile. They pushed through stone and shade, reaching for light without hesitation. The abbot walked slowly among them, stopping beside Kenta as he knelt in the garden. "Do you know," the abbot said, "how the bamboo becomes part of the grove?" Kenta looked up, wiping dirt from his hands. "By growing beside the others." The abbot nodded. "It is never invited, it simply rises." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, the monks gathered for zazen. Kenta took his usual seat at the end of the row. The air was still, the sound of bamboo rustling faint and steady. Without a word, the abbot walked to Kenta and placed an old, weathered robe in his lap. No bell rang, no chant followed, just the sound of leaves moving in wind. Kenta bowed, not in surprise, but in deep stillness, as if something already known had quietly been remembered. From that day forward, he wore the robe not as proof, but as reflection of the practice he had already lived. Moral of the story: true ordination does not begin with ceremony, but with quiet devotion. Like bamboo that grows without asking to be counted, the path becomes real not when others see it, but when we walk it in silence. Recognition may come, but only after the roots have long been planted. The next story is called The Whisper Hidden in Monastic Dust. Deep in the mountains, where the wind carries only the sound of its own passing, stood an ancient monastery that had aged into the earth itself. The wood had faded, the stones were cracked, and in the corners of every hall, dust collected soft as ash, untouched for seasons at a time. The younger monks often swept quickly, eager to keep the temple pristine. To them, the dust was a failure, a flaw to be erased. But the oldest monk, Sigen, never rushed. He moved with the slowness of someone listening to something others had long forgotten. One morning, during chores, a novice named Tomo grew impatient. "Why do we even clean?" he muttered. "The dust returns the next day. It's pointless." Sigen, hunched and quiet, paused his sweeping and looked at the sunlight streaming through the paper walls. Dust floated through each speck, glowing like a tiny star. He said, "Do you hear that?" Tomo frowned. "Hear what?" Sigen pointed to the beam of light. "The dust. It's speaking." The young monk laughed nervously. "Dust doesn't speak, master." But Sigen smiled. "Only if you expect it to shout." He leaned down, lifting a small swirl of dust with his brush. This dust was once the robes of monks long gone, the wood of trees that shaded our teachers, the smoke of incense offered by grieving hearts. It carries memory. It settles where we do not look. In its silence, it reminds us, even what we forget becomes part of the path. Tomo stood still. The air around him felt different, not heavier, but more alive. He began to sweep again, not to erase the dust, but to honor it. He moved slowly, as though listening with his hands. Later that day, he would sit in meditation and feel a peace he had never felt before, not from stillness, but from noticing. In the space between motion and rest, he heard it, a whisper too soft for ears, but clear in the heart. Moral of the story: what we overlook often holds the deepest truths. In the quietest corners, even dust becomes a teacher. When we slow down and pay attention, we discover that nothing is truly ordinary. Even silence leaves a trace. Even forgotten things speak. The next story is called Crane Feathers on the Silent Sutra. On the edge of a mist-covered lake, far from any road or village, there stood a small wooden temple weathered by years of wind, rain, and prayer. Few travelers ever found it, and those who did often said it felt more like a dream than a place. Inside the temple was a single scroll, no words, no ink, no marks at all. Just clean, pale paper resting inside a golden case. It was called the Silent Sutra. The monks would bow before it each morning, as if it contained the greatest of teachings, though nothing was written there. New visitors often left puzzled. One even asked, "Why worship a scroll that says nothing?" The abbot would only smile and reply, "It speaks only to those who do not need to hear." One winter morning, as snow began to fall in soft silence, a crane landed gently on the temple's rooftop. It stood tall and still, its white feathers blending with the sky. As the monks watched from the hall, a single feather drifted from its body and floated through the air, landing perfectly on the open scroll. No one moved. The feather lay across the empty page like a stroke of breath. Light, temporary, completely natural. A young monk named Nari whispered, "Shall we remove it?" The abbot shook his head. "No, let it rest. The scroll has been waiting." Days passed, and the feather remained. It did not rot. It did not move. It simply was. Visitors who came to see the silent sutra now wept without knowing why. Some claimed they saw words in the feather's curve. Others heard nothing, but left feeling lighter, as though something had been unspoken within them. One night, a wind passed through the temple and lifted the feather gently into the air. It floated up, circled once, then vanished out the door. The scroll was empty again, and yet it no longer felt blank. Moral of the story: the deepest teachings are not always written in ink. Sometimes wisdom arrives in a moment too delicate for words, a glance, a pause, a feather resting on silence. When we stop trying to understand everything, even emptiness begins to speak. The next story is called The Bridge That Crossed Itself. In a hidden valley surrounded by rivers and cliffs, there was a tale passed from monk to monk of a bridge that no one had built, but that somehow had always been there. It was said to appear only when the traveler no longer needed to cross, when the journey was no longer outward, but inward. Few believed it. Most thought it just a metaphor told to restless novices. But one young monk, named Ryota, believed it with his whole heart. He had suffered great loss in his youth and came to the temple, hoping that Zen practice would help him cross the deep, aching space inside him, a space he could never name but always felt. For years, he studied diligently. He meditated with discipline, chanted sutras, served tea with precision, but still the ache remained. His teachers said nothing, only pointed back to the cushion, to the present, to the breath. Yet the distance within him still felt uncrossable. One evening, after a long day of silence, Ryota walked into the valley alone. The mist hung low over the river, and the moon was rising, full and patient. He found himself at the cliff's edge, where the land split wide. Across the divide, the path continued, but there was no bridge in the air, and space, and stillness. He sat, not in frustration, not to wait, just to be. The moonlight touched his face, the wind stirred the tall grass. For the first time, he stopped trying to cross. And in that surrender, something shifted. He looked down, and there it was. Not a bridge of stone or wood, but of stillness, of awareness, of breath. The space had not changed. He had. There had always been a bridge. It simply did not appear through striving, but through seeing. It was not a path from here to there. It was the quiet truth that here and there were never separate. The bridge had not been crossed. It had crossed him. Moral of the story: some distances are not meant to be traveled, but understood. What we seek to cross is often an illusion born of longing. When we stop grasping for arrival and return to the presence within, we find that the bridge we were looking for was never outside us. It was the stillness that connects all things: the path, the crossing, and the one who walks. The next story is called Lotus Petals. Over an old grave. On a hillside beyond the monastery walls, where the grasses grew tall and the wind often carried the scent of rain, there was a single, weather-worn grave. No name marked the stone. The monks did not speak of it, but they visited it often quietly, reverently. It was said that the one buried there had once been a great teacher, though no records remained. Only silence, and the earth beneath the stone. Every spring, lotus petals from the pond below would be carried by the wind up the hill, drifting like pale prayers. No one scattered them, no one arranged them. And yet, somehow, they always landed the regathering softly on the old grave like memory itself had shape. One morning, a young monk named Arai wandered to the grave, troubled by doubt. He had struggled with his own past regrets that clung to him like mud, mistakes that followed him even into stillness. He stood before the stone and whispered, "How can we move forward when our past is so heavy? How does one forgive what can't be undone?" The abbot, who had come without a sound, stood beside him and gently said, "The one who lies here asked the same question." Arai turned, surprised. "But I thought this was a teacher's grave." "It is," the abbot said, "but before they became wise, they were deeply flawed. They hurt others, they lost their way, and when they returned, they did not erase what was done. They simply sat with it, year after year, asking nothing in return but the chance to keep walking the path." The wind stirred. A single lotus petal drifted upward from the pond and landed gently on the grave. Arai watched it fall, slow and weightless. His heart, which had felt like stone, softened just enough to feel the truth. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is honoring the pain, bowing to it, and choosing to keep walking anyway. Moral of the story: we cannot always undo the past, but we can sit beside it with gentleness. Like lotus petals falling over an old grave, grace does not erase the wounds, it simply reminds us that beauty can still land where sorrow once stood. The next story is called When the Candle Argued with the Moon. In a quiet temple nestled on a hill where the trees whispered old truths into the wind, a single candle was lit each evening in the great hall. It sat humbly on the altar, its flame small and steady, casting golden light over scrolls, statues, and silent floors. Every night, the monks bowed before it, not because it was powerful, but because it held the darkness back, if only a little. One evening, as the monks sat in meditation, the full moon rose behind the mountains, spilling silver light through the high windows. The candle's flame flickered, uneasy in the moon's glow. For the first time, it felt overshadowed. As the hall emptied and silence returned, the candle whispered to the moon, "Why must you shine so brightly? Your light swallows mine. No one sees me when you're here." The moon said nothing, but the wind stirred gently. The candle continued, frustrated. "I work so hard to hold the dark away. I burn, I give, I melt. And yet, when you rise, my light feels like nothing." Finally, the moon spoke soft and wide like the sky itself. "Little flame," it said, "do you think we are in competition? I reflect the sun. You create your own fire. I drift silently above. You stay rooted and warm the space around you. Your glow touches faces, warms hands, lights pages of sacred words. Mine touches oceans, yes, but not hearts." The candle trembled. "But I am so small." "Exactly," said the moon. "And still you are seen. Still you are needed." They sat together in the quiet hall, two kinds of light, neither greater, neither lesser, bright and distant, the other small and near. The candle no longer needed to shine more brightly. It only needed to be what it already was. Moral of the story: do not measure your light by the brightness of others. We each carry a flame that serves its own purpose. The moon reflects, the candle burns. Greatness is not in comparison, but in presence. Your quiet offering may be the very warmth someone needs. Shine gently and know that it is enough. The next story is called A Monk's Conversation with His Shadow. At a small temple carved into the side of a mountain, where the sun only reached the courtyard for a few hours each day, lived an aging monk named Tyne. He had long been known for his serenity, for the calm that seemed to live in his voice and his walk. But in his later years, Tyne began to visit the temple's meditation garden at dusk alone, long after the others had finished their evening practice. There, as the last light stretched across the stones, his shadow would grow tall behind him, and he would sit, speaking softly to it, as if it were an old friend. Many monks noticed, but none dared interrupt. Whispers spread some thought he had gone mad. Others believed he had reached some deeper level of practice they could not understand. One evening, a curious young monk named Kyo lingered quietly behind the bamboo fence and listened. Tyne spoke in a whisper. "You again, always here, always behind." The shadow, long and still on the ground, did not move. And yet the silence was thick with meaning. Tyne continued, "For many years I tried to escape you through prayers, through silence, through pretending I had no darkness. But still, you followed." He paused. "I thought enlightenment would erase you. But now I see awakening doesn't cast out the shadow. It turns and bows to it." The breeze stirred the grass. The sun dipped lower. "I hurt people once. I carried anger. I chased pride, called it wisdom. You watched it all, and still you did not leave." He reached out, gently pressing his palm against the stone where the shadow lay. "So now, I sit with you. I let you speak, because you too are part of me." Young Kyo stepped back, eyes wide not from fear, but from understanding. All this time he had tried to silence his pain, to cut out every flaw like weeds. But Tyne had learned a different path, not to fight the shadow, but to welcome it. The next evening, Kyo found his own shadow beneath the temple bell and sat with it, quietly. Moral of the story: peace is not found in denying our darkness, but in meeting it with compassion. Like a shadow that never leaves, our past walks with us not to haunt us, but to remind us what still needs our kindness. When we stop running from the shadow, we begin the real journey home. The next story is called How the River Answered the Koan. In a mountain temple carved into the rock beside a flowing river, a young monk named Anyo struggled with a single koan his master had given him months ago. "What is your face before your parents were born?" He had meditated on it day and night, twisted it through thought and breath, but no answer came. Only frustration, only silence. His master, a quiet man with eyes like still water, offered no guidance. Only the koan, and a gentle nod each time Anyo returned with yet another failed response. One morning, weary of sitting, Anyo wandered to the river's edge. The water had been his companion since his arrival, always moving, never repeating, yet always the same. He often watched it without watching, listened without hearing. This time was different. He dropped to his knees and whispered the koan aloud, not to solve it, but like a cry, "What is my face before I was born?" The river said nothing, but it moved. It passed by the rocks without struggle. It wrapped around fallen branches, carried leaves, reflected sky. It accepted what entered and released what left. It made no effort to be seen. It never asked who it was. It only flowed. Anyo sat there for hours, breath sinking with the current, until something inside him softened. He realized the river had no face, yet it was never without one. It did not begin at the mountain, nor end at the sea. It was always becoming, never lost. His thoughts grew still. Tears rose not from sadness, but from recognition. The koan was never a riddle, it was a mirror. His true face was not something to find, it was something to be, not fixed, not born, just flowing. The next morning, he bowed before his master and said only one word, "River." The master smiled not because the answer was correct, but because it was no longer needed. Moral of the story: some questions are not meant to be answered, but dissolved. When we stop grasping for identity and begin to live like the river present, fluid, free, we remember that the self is not a thing to discover, but a movement to embody. The river answers by becoming the answer. So can we. The next story is called The Scroll. The wind refused to read. In an old temple nestled between two cliffs, where hawks circled above and the wind howled through the stones, there was a scroll said to contain a teaching so profound it had never been read aloud, not even by the abbots. It was kept in a small wooden room with open windows and no locks, placed on a pedestal of worn cedar. The scroll was made of silk, hand-painted in flowing ink and wrapped with a golden thread. But each time someone tried to unroll it, the wind would rise suddenly and blow it shut. Always. Even indoors, even on still days. It was said the wind protected it, or perhaps understood it better than people ever could. Many monks had tried over the years. They bowed, they prayed, they fasted and chanted. Some tried to block the windows or hold the scroll down with stones. But still, the wind would slip in through the smallest crack, whispering, rushing, or sometimes sighing until the scroll rolled closed again. One day, a monk named Mio, quiet and curious, approached the scroll not with questions, but with presence. She did not try to read it. She simply sat beside it, day after day, dusting its case, watching how the wind touched its edges like a lover not ready to let go. Eventually, the abbot noticed her and asked, "Why do you sit by the scroll if you do not wish to read it?" Mio replied, "Because maybe the lesson is not in the ink, but in the way the wind protects it. Maybe some truths are not meant to be opened, only honored." The abbot smiled, for she had seen what many had missed. That evening, as Mio sat once more beside the scroll, a gentle breeze entered the room so soft it stirred only the corners. The scroll trembled slightly, then lay still. It did not open. It did not need to. Moral of the story: some wisdom is not meant to be grasped, but witnessed. The deepest truths often live beyond words, protected by silence, guarded by mystery. When we stop trying to possess the teaching and instead bow to its presence, we discover that reverence is itself a kind of understanding. The next story is called Pebble Offering to the Mountain. In a valley cloaked in morning fog, where the air always carried the scent of pine and stone, there stood a great mountain, ancient, unmoving, vast. Pilgrims came from far lands to climb it, seeking visions, blessings, or the silence only great heights could offer. Some left flowers, others tied cloth to trees or carved their names into bark. But there was one old monk, Isho, who came each year with nothing but a single smooth pebble. He would kneel at the mountain's base, place the pebble gently at its feet, bow once, and then walk away. No chants, no petitions. Just this small act, repeated through decades. One spring, a young novice named Kenta followed him. Kenta was eager in his practice, hungry for understanding. When he saw Ishu kneel before the mountain and place the stone, he couldn't hold his curiosity. "Master," he asked softly, "why do you offer a pebble? The mountain is already made of stone. What difference does one more make?" Isho smiled, weathered and kind. "The mountain needs nothing from me. That is why I give. The offering is not for the mountain, it's for the small part of me that still thinks it must achieve something to be worthy of reverence." Kenta looked at the tiny stone resting among thousands. "But it's so small, almost invisible." "Yes," Isho said, "but I offer it anyway, because in that moment I am not trying to be bigger than the mountain. I am simply remembering that I belong to it, that I am part of it even in my smallness." They stood in silence for a long while, the wind passing gently over the earth like a memory. Kenta bent down and picked up his own pebble, warm from the sun. He placed it next to Isho's and bowed. He felt no power in the act, no revelation, just a soft settling inside his chest, like something that had been trying too hard had finally exhaled. Moral of the story: we do not offer to the world because it needs us. We offer because we need to remember our place within it. Even the smallest gesture, made without ego, can carry the deepest reverence. True humility is not hiding it, is quietly belonging. Like a pebble resting at the foot of a mountain, asking for nothing, yet giving everything. The next story is called Enlightenment in the Left Shoe. In a simple Zen monastery near the edge of a quiet rice field, daily life was filled with ordinary ritual sweeping, bowing, eating, walking. There were no dramatic sermons, no lofty proclamations, just steady, mindful living. The monks were taught that the path to awakening could be found not in distant mountains or sacred scrolls, but in the smallest of actions, repeated with full attention. One monk, Genjo, struggled with this teaching. He longed for a sign, a lightning strike of wisdom, a sudden vision, anything that would confirm his progress. Surely, he thought, enlightenment must be something more than chores and silence. One morning, after a restless night of doubt, Genjo was late for morning meditation. In his rush, he threw on his robe and sandals hastily. But as he stepped into the zendo and bowed, he felt something strange, a small, sharp pebble inside his left shoe. He tried to ignore it, but with every step, it pressed into the sole of his foot, stubborn and precise. As the bell rang and silence filled the hall, Genjo sat. But his mind would not. The pebble became a mountain. His thoughts raced. Why now? Why this? How can I meditate when I can barely sit still? Time slowed. Sweat formed on his brow, and frustration burned behind his calm posture. But then, something happened. He took a breath, not to resist the discomfort, not to fight it, but to simply feel it. He noticed its shape, its place, its persistence. He breathed again, letting go of the resistance, and suddenly the pain softened, not because it disappeared, but because he stopped pushing against it. The pebble remained, but now it was just a pebble. After the meditation ended, Genjo removed his shoe and held it in his hand. The stone fell into his palm, small, plain, ordinary, and yet it had shown him something greater than all the sutras he'd read. He smiled, bowed to the shoe, and walked away barefoot, lighter, not in body, but in spirit. Moral of the story: enlightenment does not always arrive through grand revelations. Sometimes it comes quietly in a pebble, a shoe, a single breath of surrender. When we stop demanding awakening to look a certain way, we find it hiding in the most unexpected places, right beneath our feet. The next story is called When the Drumbeat Became the Question. In a forest monastery where the trees stood like sentinels and the wind moved as slowly as thought, the monks gathered each morning to sit in silence before a great wooden drum. It hung in the zendo like a heartbeat made visible around, worn smooth by years of use. Each day at dawn, one monk would strike the drum. 3 beats, then stillness. The sound would echo through the forest, waking birds, stirring mist, and inviting the world to listen. For years, the task belonged to the same monk, Taira, known for his calm and precision. But one season, the abbot passed the duty to a younger monk named Koji, who had been struggling deeply with doubt. Koji feared he wasn't ready. He practiced at night when no one watched, striking the drum with trembling hands. It never felt right. The sound was either too soft or too sharp, too empty or too full. He wanted it to be perfect, balanced, sacred, worthy. But each time he raised the mallet, he heard only his own anxiety. On the morning of his first public strike, the sky was still dark. The monks sat in neat rows. The forest held its breath. Koji stepped forward, hands cold. He raised the mallet, then hesitated. He closed his eyes. What is the perfect sound? What is the right beat? What if I get it wrong? And then he heard it. What if the drum beat is not the answer, but the question? He struck the drum. The first beat rang out, not perfect, but true. The second followed softer, steadier. The third a quiet exhale, not of sound, but of surrender. Then silence. The monks did not move. Something in the air had shifted. It wasn't the precision of the beat, it was the honesty of it. Later, Koji asked the abbot, "Did I strike it correctly?" The abbot smiled gently. "You struck it honestly. That is always correct." Koji realized that the drum had never demanded certainty. It had always been waiting for presence. Moral of the story: the path is not about perfect answers, but honest questions. True practice does not come from knowing, it comes from showing up, trembling and unsure, and striking the moment with your whole being. Sometimes the beat itself is not a reply. It is the question you finally stop running from. The next story is called The Bowl That Never Emptied. At the heart of a high mountain monastery, known not for its wealth but for its kindness, there was an old wooden bowl kept on the altar in the dining hall. It was chipped along the rim and stained from years of use, but it was never thrown away. The monks called it the bowl that never emptied, though no one quite knew why. It wasn't magical. It didn't fill itself. It didn't glow or float or whisper. It just sat there, simple, worn, waiting. But one winter, a severe storm struck the valley. Snow buried the paths. Supplies ran low. The harvest had been poor that year, and the monks began to ration their meal-cutting portions in half, then again. Some days, the only offering at the altar was a single grain of rice. Still, each morning, the head monk would bow to the bowl, place whatever little they had inside, and whisper, "Enough." One novice, hungry and confused, finally asked, "Master, why do we keep offering to an empty bowl when we have so little left? Wouldn't it be wiser to feed ourselves?" The old monk smiled gently and said, "This bowl is not for food, it is for faith." He placed his hand on the young monk's shoulder. When we had abundance, it was easy to give. But true generosity is revealed when we offer from scarcity. This bowl reminds us that emptiness is not the absence of something, but the openness to everything. The next morning, as the monks prepared to share a small bowl of porridge between them, a traveler arrived, lost, cold, and carrying a basket. Inside were fresh vegetables, dried rice, and warm bread. "The snow melted early down the mountain," the traveler said. "I felt called to bring this here, though I didn't know why." The monks welcomed him in silence, served him first, and placed a portion in the old wooden bowl. Again, it was full. From that day on, no matter how much or how little they had, the monks continued to offer to the bowl each morning, and somehow it was never empty. Moral of the story: true abundance begins with the willingness to give, even when we have little. The heart that offers without fear becomes a vessel that cannot run dry. Emptiness, when held with faith, becomes the space where grace arrives. The next story is called The Zen of Threading a Needle in the Dark. There was once an elderly nun named Mayo, who lived in a quiet cottage at the edge of a monastery, where the lanterns flickered softly and the wind was known to recite sutras through cracks in the wall. Her hands were steady, her steps light, and though she no longer led chants or sat for long hours in meditation, the monks often said her silence carried more weight than their sermons. Each evening, she would sit by her window and mend robe-torn sleeves, fraying hems, the secret damage that comes from long devotion. But one winter night, a sudden storm stole the power, and the room was plunged into darkness. The lamp went out. The fire died low. Still, she did not stop. A young monk named Ren, passing by, saw her through the shadows and asked, "Mayo-san, "How can you thread a needle in the dark? Why not wait for the morning?" She smiled, but did not look up. "I've done this so long, I no longer rely on light. My hands remember what my eyes do not. I feel the thread, not chase it." Ren stepped inside, humbled. "But what if you miss?" "I often do," she said gently. "But the thread still finds its way. It is patient with me." They sat together in the quiet, listening to the storm rattle the shutters. Mayo continued to sew knot quickly, not perfectly, but with full attention. After a long pause, she said, "This is how Zen is sometimes. Not clarity, not brilliance, just trust. Threading small truths through the darkness. Not needing to see, only to stay still long enough to feel." Ren breathed slowly, letting her words rest inside him. He thought of his own practice, always straining for answers, for illumination, for proof. But here, in this room with no light, a robe was still being mended. Not because the conditions were perfect, but because the heart was quiet. Moral of the story: wisdom does not always come with light. Sometimes the truest practice is done in the dark, with patience, with trust, and with hands that keep moving even when the path is unseen. When we stop demanding clarity and begin to feel our way forward, we discover that even in darkness, the thread still finds the needle. The next story is called Saffron Robes, Hanging on the Wind. In a remote monastery perched at the edge of a cliff, the monks followed a quiet rhythm of life. They spoke little, walked slowly, and bowed often. Each morning, saffron robes were washed by hand in the river and hung to dry on a long line stretched between two trees, where the wind blew wild and free. The robes fluttered like flames bright against the pale sky. Travelers passing below would often pause, gazing up in wonder, mistaking them for flags or holy banners. But to the monks, they were simply garments worn, washed, and worn again. One afternoon, a young monk named Riku was tasked with washing the robes. As he clipped the last one to the line, a strong gust of wind tore it away. The robe soared into the air, spiraling down the cliff, vanishing into the canyon below. Panicked, Riku ran to the edge and dropped to his knees, watching it disappear into the clouds. His face was flushed with shame. That robe had been passed down from his teacher. It was his only one. He went to the abbot, expecting to be scolded, but the abbot only looked out toward the canyon and said softly, "So, the wind needed a robe today." Riku was silent. The abbot turned to him. "Why do you hold so tightly to what must move?" "But it was mine," Riku whispered. "It was all I had." The abbot placed a hand on his shoulder. "Nothing we wear is ever truly ours. The robe is only a reminder not of possession, but of presence. If the wind took it, then perhaps it was time to wear something else." That evening, Riku sat watching the empty clotheslines swaying in the dusk. He imagined the robe drifting down through the sky, brushing branches, catching the light. And for the first time, he felt a strange joy, not from having, but from letting go. Moral of the story: what we think we own is often just visiting us. When we let go of what the wind takes, we make space to see what remains. The freedom to walk unburdened, and the truth that the robe never made. The monket only pointed to the one who wore it with grace. The next story is called Footsteps That Vanished Mid-Walk. In the far north, where the snow falls without end and silence covers the earth like a prayer unspoken, there was once a monk who walked a single path each day across the frozen lake behind the monastery, to a tree standing alone in the white expanse. He would leave at dawn and return by dusk, never missing a day, even when the wind stung like knives and the world felt hollow with cold. He left no written teachings, he offered no lectures. Only his footsteps remained perfectly spaced, straight as a line of thought-faint impressions pressed into the snow. But one morning, after many seasons had passed, something strange happened. The monks awoke to find his footsteps, began, as always, leading across the lake, but then they stopped. Mid-walk, no return path, no signs of struggle, just an open field of snow, smooth as sky. He was gone. The monks searched for hours, days, weeks. No sign of the old Manut beneath the ice, not in the forest, not even a single torn thread from his robe. In time, the abbot gathered the monks and stood by the last footprint, etched alone in the silence. He bent down, touched the snow gently, and whispered. This was his final teaching. One novice wept. But Master, he left no words, no answer. The abbot nodded. Exactly. He rose and looked at the wide, undisturbed snow. Each day, he walked not to arrive, but to disappear. He did not cling to the path, nor the role, nor the self. His walk was not a journey, it was a letting go. The footsteps were never meant to last, and when there was nothing left to leave behind, he stopped. The monks stood quietly, the wind threading through their robes, and in that wide, white silence they understood. Not all disappearances are loss, some are return. Moral of the story. The path does not always end with arrival sometimes. It ends with release. When we no longer need to be seen, to be known, to leave a mark behind, we return to the source without struggle. True presence leaves no trace, and sometimes the greatest teaching is the one that vanishes mid-walk. The next story is called The Frog and the Empty Lotus. In a quiet marsh just beyond the monastery walls, where the reeds swayed gently and dragonflies shimmered in the sun, there bloomed a single lotus every summer. Its petals were wide, white with soft pink edges, and many monks would sit nearby in the evenings, meditating by its side as the frogs croaked their gentle chorus. One day, a small green frog hopped into the center of the lotus blossom and made it his home. He sat there for hours, unmoving, as if he too were meditating. The monks began to notice. One said, "Even this frog seeks stillness." Another smiled. "Perhaps he will awaken before us all." But then, as the days grew hotter, the lotus petals withered and fell. The blossom closed, its beauty gone, and the frog was left sitting in the center of an empty podry plain and no longer admired. The monks waited to see if the frog would leave, but he stayed. Each day he sat just as before, silent and still in what was now just the husk of a flower. A young monk finally asked, "Why does he stay? The beauty is gone. The lotus is empty." The abbot, who had been quietly observing from the shade, said, "Because the frog did not come for the beauty. He came for the stillness, and that has not left." That night, the moon rose full and bright. The marsh glowed silver, and the frog remained in his place, concerned with petals or praise or loss. The young monk returned the next morning and sat beside the dry lotus for the first time. He understood now. The frog had not been seeking a place to be seen, but a place to be. Moral of the story. True peace is not found in what pleases the eye, but in what calms the heart. Beauty fades, forms change, but stillness remains. Like the frog in the empty lotus, we awaken not by holding on to what was lovely, but by staying present when all else has fallen away. The next story is called The Answer Buried in Sand. On the edge of a vast desert, where the wind hummed ancient secrets and the dunes shifted like waves in slow motion, there stood a solitary hermit who had long ago turned his back on temples and teachings. He spoke little, wore robes, faded the color of stone, and spent his days drawing circles in the sand. Pilgrims still came to find him, not for blessings or miracles, but because word had spread that he once solved a koan so deep, even his master could not answer it. They came seeking that answer, but he never gave it. One day, a young seeker named Imai arrived sunburned, tired, and full of longing. He had studied every sutra, sat through every retreat, and still his heart felt like a closed fist. His teacher had given him a final koan before sending him out. Where does the answer go when the question ends? Imai bowed to the hermit and pleaded, "Please, I've traveled across mountains, rivers, and now this desert. I've let go of comfort, pride, even fear. Just tell me, where is the answer?" The hermit said nothing. He simply motioned for Imai to sit. For 3 days, they sat in silence. Each morning, the hermit rose early and used a simple stick to draw a single pattern in the sand, a spiral, always starting from the outside and moving inward. By dusk, the wind would erase it completely. The next morning, he would begin again. On the 4th day, Imai could bear it no longer. "Why draw what will be erased?" he asked. "Why repeat what is never seen?" The hermit looked at him for the first time and whispered, "Because truth is not kept, it is revealed again and again. The answer is not hidden beneath the sand. The answer is the sand. It's the drawing, the erasing, the silence in between." Imai's breath caught. He looked at the smooth, empty ground where yesterday's spiral had vanished, and suddenly his question no longer needed an answer. Moral of the story: truth is not something to be possessed. It lives in impermanence, in the fleeting mark drawn and then carried away by the wind. When we stop demanding permanence, we find that what was buried was never lost. It was simply waiting for us to see it vanish without fear. The next story is called The Mountain That Meditated. Far beyond the last village, past rivers that no longer had names, there stood a great mountain wrapped in mist and time. It had no temple on its peak, no carved steps along its side. And yet, the monks from the valley temple often spoke of it with reverence, as if it were one of their own. They said the mountain was always meditating. To some, this sounded poetic. To others, absurd. But one young monk named Soma became deeply curious. "How can a mountain meditate?" he asked the abbot one morning, as they swept fallen leaves from the stone path. "It doesn't move. It doesn't breathe. It doesn't seek." The abbot smiled. Exactly. Soma was not satisfied. One day, without permission or plan, he packed a small bundle and began walking toward the mountain. He crossed through fields, climbed past old trees, and slept beneath stars that watched without judgment. For 3 days he walked, and the mountain grew larger, so vast it seemed to touch the sky. When he finally reached its base, Soma sat down at the edge of a ridge and looked up. There was no sound but the wind and the faint rustling of leaves. The mountain said nothing. It simply stood. Soma waited. He meditated. He listened. Hours passed. Then a full day. And still, the mountain remained silent, unchanging, still. Frustrated, Soma finally spoke aloud. "I came all this way, and you offer me nothing?" A breeze passed. The grass bent, and a single stone rolled softly down the slope beside him. And in that quiet moment, something shifted. He realized. The mountain was teaching. It had always been teaching. Not in words, not in gestures, but in its steady presence. It did not chase the clouds that passed above it. It did not flinch in storms. It rose from the earth with dignity, rooted, vast, and completely at peace with what came and went. Soma bowed deeply, not to the mountain, but to the silence within himself that had finally heard. Moral of the story: true meditation is not always found in stilling the mind, but in becoming like the mountain, anchored, open, and patient. When we stop demanding answers and instead listen with our whole being, we discover that silence is not the absence of wisdom, it is its purest form. The next story is called A Prayer Folded into Origami. In a temple that overlooked rice fields and low clouds, there lived an old woman named Satomi, who was not a monk, not a scholar, and not a teacher yet. The monks often bowed to her as they passed. She lived in a small room by the bell tower, surrounded by scraps of paper. Day after day, she folded cranes, lotuses, turtles, and shapes no one else could name. One morning, a young monk named Haruki approached her with trembling hands. His father had fallen ill, and no amount of chanting or incense had quieted the storm in his heart. He asked, "Satomi-san, will you write a prayer for my father?" She did not speak. She simply took a square of thin rice paper, blank and soft, and began to fold. She made no mark, no words, no brush, just silent moves creases, gentle corners tucked with care. In moments, the paper became a crane, wings slightly lifted as if about to take flight. She handed it to him and bowed. Haruki stared at it, confused. "But you didn't write anything." Satomi smiled, her hands resting quietly in her lap. "The prayer is not in the ink," she whispered. "It's in the folding." He looked again at the crane. The folds were smooth but imperfect, the shape delicate and full of breath. He held it closer, and for the first time in days, his chest softened. Not because his fear vanished, but because he had been seen without question, without words. Satomi spoke again, softer this time. "When the heart is true, the paper listens. Every crease holds an intention. Every corner folded with compassion becomes a sentence the wind can read. The crane will carry your prayer not through magic, but through meaning." That night, Haruki placed the crane by his father's bedside. The old man smiled in his sleep for the first time since falling ill. Haruki didn't know what had changed, but something had. And in the stillness, the prayer unfolded not into words, but into presence. Moral of the story: not all prayers are spoken. Some are folded with care, breathed into silence, and offered without needing to be understood. When our intention is pure, even the quietest gesture becomes a sacred message. Sometimes, the most powerful prayers are the ones never said, but gently shaped by hand, and given with the heart. The next story is called The Bell Tower with No Bell. In the center of a quiet temple, nestled between two rivers, there stood an old wooden bell tower. Its beams were weathered, moss growing between the stones at its base. Visitors often looked up in confusion, for there was no bell hanging inside, only an empty space where the great bronze bell had once been. The story went that the bell had cracked long ago during a fierce lightning storm, splitting down its center with a sound so loud that even the trees seemed to bow. Afterward, the monks removed the bell, but they left the tower standing. No new bell was ever hung, and yet, every morning at dawn, the monks would gather in silence at its base. A young monk named Haru, new to the temple, watched this ritual day after day with quiet wonder. Finally, one morning, he asked the abbot, "Why do we gather here if there is no bell to ring?" The abbot looked up at the empty frame and smiled. "Who says there is no bell?" Haru frowned. "But I hear nothing." "That's because you are listening with your ears," the abbot said. "Try listening with your heart." The next morning, Haru joined the others again. As the first light broke over the hills, the monks stood in silence beneath the bell tower. No chime sounded, no rope was pulled. And yet, in that silence, Haru began to feel something, a presence, a weightless sound that was not heard, but felt like a memory that had never been his, or a truth too soft for words. He realized then, the monks weren't ringing a bell, they were ringing awareness. The bell tower had become something deeper than wood and rope. It was a symbolic reminder that what awakens us is not always a sound, but the willingness to be still enough to hear what is already there. Moral of the story: not all bells ring. Some simply remind us to listen. When we stop expecting sound and instead open ourselves to silence, we discover that presence alone can awaken us. The truest call to mindfulness is often the one that arrives without a single sound. The next story is called When Rain Taught Impermanence. In a hillside temple draped with ivy and thyme, the roof tiles clicked gently in the wind, and the air always smelled faintly of cedar and old stone. It was a place where clouds often lingered, and rain came without warning, soft, steady, as if the sky itself were breathing. A young monk named Nari sat restlessly in the meditation hall. She had lost someone close, and though the rituals were complete, her sorrow clung like wet fabric. She chanted, she bowed, she swept fallen leaves each morning. Still, the ache remained, stubborn as fog. One afternoon, the rain began. Not a storm, not a downpour, just a slow, endless tapping across the wooden deck outside. Nari sat alone, unable to focus, her breath shallow. She whispered to herself, "Why do things disappear? Why must everything leave?" As if in answer, the old abbot entered silently and sat beside her. He said nothing at first, only listened with her to the rhythm of the rain, drop by drop, tile by tile. After some time, he spoke. "Do you hear it?" he asked. Nari nodded. "Yes, the rain." He tilted his head. "No, change. That's what you're hearing." She turned to him, confused. He pointed to the puddles forming in the courtyard. Each drop was once a cloud. Before that, mist. Before that, sky. It never vanished, it only changed. Nari watched as one drop fell into a puddle and disappeared. Not with violence, not with struggle, just gone. And yet, still present in the ripples. The abbot continued, "You grieve because what you love has changed shape. You can no longer hold it. But impermanence is not cruelty. It is the gentle truth behind all beauty. Like rain here for a breath, then gone. But never wasted." A tear slipped down Nari's cheek, and for the first time, she didn't wipe it away. Outside, the rain kept falling, not to drown, not to destroy, but to soften the world, to remind it that nothing stays, and nothing is ever truly gone. Moral of the story: impermanence is not loss, it is transformation. When we stop clinging to form and begin to honor change, we find that even sorrow carries grace. Like rain, what falls is not gone, it simply becomes something new. To listen deeply is to hear the beauty of what never stays, and yet, somehow, always remains. The next story is called The Willow That Refused to Bend. Beside a narrow stream near the edge of a mountain village, there grew a willow tree unlike any other. Its trunk was thick and stiff, its branches oddly upright, refusing to sway like the others. While the other willows danced gently in the wind, this one stood rigid, proud, unmoving. The villagers called it the stubborn willow and warned their children not to sit beneath it. "It doesn't know how to bow," they'd say. "One day it will break." At the nearby monastery, an old monk named Haku often led walking meditations along the stream. He never spoke of the willow, but he always paused near it, eyes soft, as though listening for something it could not say. One summer, the winds grew stronger. Storms swept through the valley, bending trees and flooding fields. The other willows bowed low, their branches brushing the earth like open palms. But the stiff willow stood tall, refusing to yield. Then one night, under a sky full of thunder, a great gust cracked through the air, and with it, a loud snap. In the morning, the villagers found the proud willow split down the center, its great trunk shattered, its crown torn open. Many shook their heads and said, "It never learned." But when Monk Haku arrived, he sat quietly beside the broken tree and whispered, "You tried to be strong, but strength without softness is brittle." A young novice who stood beside him asked, "Master, how do we know when to stand firm and when to bend?" Haku picked up a small branch from a neighboring willow, still wet with rain. He bent it gently between his fingers, it bowed, and returned without breaking. He said, "Firmness without surrender becomes pride. Softness without awareness becomes fear. But to know when to bow and still rise again, That is wisdom. The novice nodded, watching as the wind moved through the other trees, which bowed and swayed like monks in prayer. They had bent, but they were still standing. Moral of the story: true strength is not in resisting the storm, but in knowing how to yield without breaking. Like the willow that bends and rises again, wisdom lies in the dance between endurance and surrender. What survives is not what never bows, but what knows when to. The next story is called Silence. Hidden in bamboo flute cracks, at the edge of a mist-filled mountain village, there lived an old monk who crafted bamboo flutes not to perform, not to sell, but to listen. His flutes were strange to many. They were rough, unfinished, and each held a visible crack somewhere along its body. The villagers would say, "They cannot be played properly," but the monk only smiled and kept making them. One summer, a traveling musician named Kiko arrived. She had heard of the monk and his strange instruments and sought him out, curious and skeptical. She was trained in the great cities, where precision was sacred and sound was everything. When the monk offered her one of his flutes, she hesitated. "This is cracked," she said. "The air will escape." He nodded. "Exactly." Still, she lifted it to her lips and played. The note that came out was fractured, airy, unfinished. She stopped immediately, disappointed. "It's broken," she said. "The note is not whole." The monk motioned for her to sit beneath the trees. They sat together for some time, cicadas buzzing in the warm air, a distant wind rustling the bamboo grove nearby. Then the monk lifted one of his cracked flutes and played not a song, but a breath. A few quiet notes, incomplete, ghostly, yet somehow whole. He looked at her and said, "Sound without space is noise, but sound with space, that is music. What you call a crack, I call a gate. Through it, the silence enters." Kiko blinked. "The silence?" "Yes," the monk said. "The silence is what gives the sound its soul. Without the crack, there is no place for silence to rest. A perfect note may impress the ear, but a broken one, when played with heart, reaches the spirit." She looked again at the flute, and this time she understood. The crack wasn't a flaw. It was an opening. For breath, for emptiness, for feeling. She played again, slower now, and in that imperfect sound she heard something she had never heard before herself. Moral of the story: what we call broken may simply be the space through which truth enters. In imperfection, silence is born, and in silence, depth. The soul of a sound lives not in its volume, but in the quiet hidden within its cracks. When we stop chasing perfection, we finally hear what was always there, waiting. The next story is called The Statue That Looked Away. In the center of an old temple courtyard, surrounded by smooth stones and wind-worn lanterns, stood a statue of the Buddha carved from gray mountain rock. But unlike other statues, this one did not gaze forward with calm eyes or closed lids. Instead, its face was gently turned to the side, as if looking away from those who knelt before it. Many visitors found it strange. "Why does the Buddha turn his face?" they would ask. "Is he ignoring us? Is it a mistake?" The monks never answered directly. They simply bowed as usual, placed fresh incense before the statue, and continued their silent practice. One day, a traveler named Yuto arrived, seeking answers. He had suffered a great betrayal, abandoned by friends, shamed by failure, aching with resentment he could not shake. He came to the temple hoping the Buddha would see him, but when he knelt and looked up, he saw only the profile of the statue, its gaze turned away from his pain. Frustrated, Yuto confronted the abbot. "Why will your Buddha not face me? Does he not care for suffering? Does he turn from those in need?" The abbot, old and calm as Riverstone, walked with him back to the statue. They sat together in the fading light of day. The abbot spoke gently. He does not turn away from you. He turns away from the illusion of you, the story you carry, the blame, the mask. Yuto frowned. Then what does he look toward? The abbot pointed toward the open sky. He looks toward the path, not the past. Toward forgiveness, not the wound. Toward truth, not identity. Yuto sat in silence. He realized the statue was not ignoring him. It was inviting him to let go of being seen and instead to see. That evening, Yuto returned to the statue. He didn't kneel. He simply sat beside it, quietly looking in the same direction toward the trees, the wind, the space beyond the self he'd been clinging to. And in that moment, he felt a strange peace, the kind that doesn't need to be seen to be known. Moral of the story: the wisdom we seek often begins when we stop demanding to be understood. Like the Buddha who looks away, truth invites us to turn our gaze from identity and pain toward the quiet path ahead. In learning to see beyond ourselves, we find the presence that has always been beside us. In a world that moves fast and demands more, these stories invite us to move inward, to pause, to breathe, and to listen. Whether it's the frog in the empty lotus, the monk who folded the wind, or the bell that never rang, each story carries a quiet lesson. That peace is not something we chase, it's something we uncover. From patience in bamboo groves to forgiveness over old graves, these reflections remind us that stillness isn't silence, it's presence. That even in broken mala beads, missing slippers, and whispering shadows, the path to inner harmony is always beneath our feet, waiting to be noticed. Now we'd love to hear from you. Which story spoke to your heart the most? Was it the raindrop bowing to the ocean? The statue that looked away? Share your reflection in the comments. We're listening. And if you want more calm, clarity, and Zen wisdom in your journey, don't forget to subscribe and walk this path with us. Let's keep unfolding peace, one story at a time.